My name is Michelle, and I am teaching today with Anthony and Jeff. We work for BioNetwork. So if you aren't familiar with BioNetwork, we basically are a state-funded organization, and basically North Carolina taxes go to pay for these classes, which means that companies get them free or at an extremely reduced price. We also have other sectors that do lab work and also a program, an engagement program where they go to kids' schools, K through 12, and they'll do experiments with them and get them excited about the sciences. It's a lot of fun. So that's what your state taxes are going towards. We are talking about fundamentals of food safety today, and this is going to be an interesting class because we're going to be going through USDA regulations and FDA regulations because of your product and how it's going to be controlled. All right, and let's start off our course with a video.
Recent high-profile food recalls serve as a cautionary tale. Texas-based Bluebell Creameries voluntarily recalled all of its products after 2 samples of ice cream tested positive for listeria in April. That outbreak resulted in 3 deaths in Kansas and illnesses across Kansas and Texas. It took 4 months for Bluebell ice cream to reappear on grocery shelves. E. coli outbreaks have hurt other major food companies. In 1996, 66 illnesses and the death of a child were blamed on E. coli in Odwalla juice. In 2007, Tops Meat Company, one of the biggest U.S. frozen hamburger makers, said it was going out of business a week after recalling 21.7 million pounds of ground beef because of possible E. coli contamination. Peanut Corporation of America, a peanut processor, blamed for a salmonella outbreak that led to 9 deaths and more than 700 illnesses, filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy court protection in 2009, just days after Texas health officials recalled all products made at its Texas plant. Health officials are investigating an E. coli outbreak linked to Chipotle restaurants in Washington state and Oregon. The source of the current outbreak is currently under investigation. Chipotle operates over 1,700 restaurants in the U.S. and elsewhere. It has not yet stated whether it has plans to close additional locations.
All right, if you are comfortable unmuting, we're going to make this a really quick exercise. This is the deer and the grapevine fable. And the goal of this exercise is just to get us used to talking together in here, whether that's via chat or unmuting yourself or typing on the screen. Okay. And the goal is to look at the picture. And I want you to think about what story is being told through this picture. So this is an actual real fable, the deer and the grapevine fable. It's a story that comes with a lesson or a teaching, right? And so if you, as a group, would look at the picture, talk about what you think's going on, and come up with a story that has some kind of a lesson. And you're welcome to start whenever you would like. I can get you started. We've got 3 hunters, and we've got a deer hanging out behind some grapevines in our forest. So what do you think is the story going on here? Again, you can type in chat or you can unmute yourself.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Looking at this picture, I'm thinking only one of them seems to be shooting the bow. But 3 of them are hunting. And so I think they're all working together on one mission. Let's call it the hunt.
Yeah.
But they have different roles within that. One's actually taking the shot. One's maybe looking out to make sure there's not another animal in the forest that can hurt them. So maybe like that, we as a team we have one mission, but we have different roles within that mission.
I love that. That's fabulous. One mission.
Probably the last inquiry, right? I've never seen a purple deer, so I think they're hunting aliens. I think they met an alien. I think it's an alien deer.
It's alien deer. Yes. We'll label him alien deer. He's purple.
Looks purple on my screen.
I dig it. He is on my screen. He's like a little bit purple and brown. Yeah. Adam, similar to hazmat suit. I can't hear. Oh no! All right, Adam. Real quick, guys. Adam has an audio issue, and I'm gonna message him. If you would just, if you have anything else to add to the story, real quick, I'm gonna handle this real quick. If Jeff or Anthony, if you would take over quick. Thanks.
Well, I was just thinking that the grape flavored venison is probably going to be super tasty. It's probably the king has dispatched the finest hunters to go acquire that.
I would know that they're very well dressed for a hunting expedition.
You're right, they are. Steven says grape flavored venison. LOL. Yeah, agreed. I feel like there's a lot new product there.
I have heard of people, like soaking meat in wine before cooking it. So technically, that would be grape flavored. Wine marinated venison is grape flavored.
That's a fair point.
There's a few more steps, but it's not. It's not like Fago.
The hunter in the middle is concerned because the maximum residue limit of grape juice on deer required by the USDA at the time of harvest is fairly low.
Gabby says she's going to put on a slightly nerdy twist and say that the Hunter 2 and 3 didn't roll well enough on perception checks, but Hunter 1 rolled pretty well. Oh, that makes me so happy.
We'll remember writing that one down for future. That one's fantastic.
The grape deer is actually a magical beast and not an animal, so they don't have advantage.
Let's see.
Careful when we pop the lid off this one, guys.
Looks like a deer on the ground already shot, dying in its last breath. Oh, this was pretty stellar, guys. I'm impressed. Do you want to know the actual fable? So the actual fable is the 3 hunters are walking through the woods and this deer hears them coming. And so he goes and hides behind the grapevines. And they pass him by. So he's safe. Then he gets a little hungry and he's like, hey, there's this grapevine right here. I'm going to eat it up. So he goes, he starts chomping down, chowing. And then the 3 hunters come back from the other direction. He didn't expect that. So now he's exposed and they see him and they shoot him and he's dinner. So it's a little dark, a lot darker than the fun things you guys came up with. But essentially the moral is don't bite the hand that feeds you, right? Yeah. This is great. I'm so excited. Failed stealth check. You're right. Totally a failed stealth check. I love when I have D&D players in classes and we do this because you always get the most exciting stories. All right. So for our setup today during class, we're going to do a lunch break. We'll probably do that about halfway at noon. We'll take a half hour for lunch, and then we will probably do 1 or 2 15-minute breaks in between. We're going to try and finish by 2. We'll do our best. This is what we're covering today. So you got a little intro in the beginning in that video to what happens in the industry, why we end up with these regulations, usually because of recalls and people dying, things going poorly, just some stuff out in the world that we need to handle. So because of that, we have the FDA and the USDA, so it's the Food and Drug Administration, and the United States Department of Agriculture. The other acronym in there are a lot of acronyms in food safety. Fun is FSMA. That's the Food Safety Modernization Act. That is the regulation that came about, was signed into law by Obama in 2011. And it happened because of, for one, that Peanut Butter Corporation of America incident that the video talked about. But also because we're having an increased number of our population affected by allergens, and also because of sanitation issues around listeria. So, for example, Bluebell ice cream had a listeria outbreak. They didn't know it, but it was in their freezer where they were storing their ice cream. And, they were making those little cups that you got when you were a kid, like the chocolate and the vanilla and the swirl, and they were sending them to elderly care homes. And, when you think about how you eat that, like you're holding it in your hand and you got the little wooden spatula thing, right? And so you're touching the outside of it while you're eating it. And so it's pretty easy to see how something on the outside of the package could accidentally end up being ingested by somebody. And so they unfortunately ended up killing 3 people. And that resulted in a massive market share loss. Of course, they fired half of their staff, and they brought some of them back, but at a lower pay to do sanitation. And then a couple years later, they had a big recall. This time, it was listeria again, right? And if you don't know what listeria is, it's a bacteria, a pathogenic bacteria that, if ingested, can cause serious gastric issues. And if you develop listeriosis, it's the potential for death is about 33%. So about 1 in 3 people die. And it can also cause stillbirth. So it's a pretty serious one. So for their second time around, the listeria came in on their cookie dough. So they were getting cookie dough from a supplier. It was contaminated with listeria and brought it back into their facility. So they had a big recall again. So when we talk about the different types of regulations like HACCP, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points, and the Food Safety Modernization Act, we saw a strengthening of the requirements for food products around supply chain control. So you think about, like, if they've been testing the cookie dough coming in, they could have prevented that recall. Sanitation, if they had been cleaning their facility, if they had been actively looking for indicator organisms, so other types of listeria than Listeria monocytogenes, if they had been looking for those microbes that live in their environment, then they would have reduced the likelihood of having that recall significantly. So it increased sanitation controls, supply chain controls, and allergen controls. And the other thing that we saw for this regulation is that suddenly we had food safety plans. So basically a plan to look at what could potentially go wrong and how we prevent those things from happening was required now for anyone who has anything to do with a food or beverage product. Even the packaging people have to do food safety plans. They have to follow preventive controls for human foods, which is the regulation that was created by FSMA. So just a quick why we're here, what's happening, things we're talking about. Then we're going to go into food safety fundamentals, looking at the basics, what happens to your body and why we care so much about protecting the people. When people ask me about my job, I tell them that what I do is I teach people how to keep grandmas and babies safe, because those are the at-risk people in our population, right? Really young kids, elderly adults, people whose immune systems aren't functioning as well as the average person. Then we have CGMPs, that's current good manufacturing practices. Those are the basic things that you do every day in your facility. If I were to liken it to my kitchen, it's about having a clean kitchen. It's about my refrigerator working properly and my oven working properly. It's about me washing my hands, right? If I'm not doing those things, if I'm not keeping my dog out of the kitchen, right, you probably don't want to eat the food that I'm making in my kitchen. So for your facility, it's about maintenance of your equipment. It's about your own personnel practices, hygiene, knowing your job, getting trained, and making sure that your facility is nice and clean. So we'll go into both sets of regulations, HACCP and preventive controls for human foods, because believe our meats, right? You guys, your process is going to be overseen by the FDA and the USDA, which makes your product pretty unique. So it adds a little bit of stuff to what you've got going on. And then we'll finish with good documentation practices. And I have a quiz available to you in Google Classroom. It's on a Google form. So if the Google Forms are working for you, I'll go through that. If not, it's fine. Not a big deal. So our objectives basically are to get us used to talking about food safety, building a food safety culture in our system, and to understand what these basic requirements are that come from our government. So speaking of, so the Food and Drug Administration is basically our government regulatory agency that's tasked with a whole bunch of different things. They cover things from products that emit radiation to cigarettes to food to medicine, right? It's a whole lot, cosmetics, a lot of things that they handle. And so their goal is essentially to protect consumers. And they do that through regulations. The reason that they were created was, the reason that they got power, essentially, was because there was a person who was manufacturing cough syrup, and they had been just doing cough drops up until that point. But they're like, hey, people want liquid cough syrup, right? And this is back in the day, like you're talking like before refrigeration's really a big thing. Before we have like the ability to like really supply on a huge level, to the extent that we do now, like globally and so forth. So it wasn't really it was happening, but on a very limited scale. And so this guy who's making cough medicine, he decided to use glycol as a mixing agent in the product. Usually these kinds of products, they use alcohol or something like that. So he chose to use glycol, but he used a type of glycol that was not food safe. And he ended up, unfortunately, killing several children. And so the FDA was established at this point, but they just didn't have the same powers that they do now. And so they wanted to get this product back, obviously, but nobody wanted to cop to actually being involved with the product, having made it, having sold it. And so they really struggled to get it recalls. And the only reason they were actually legally allowed to get it recalled was because it was mislabeled. So that's why we got the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, why the FDA has a lot of the powers that it has today, so that, should something happen like this, they have the power to go to companies, get back products, audit them, check up on them, making sure that they're essentially being safe. The FDA is basically looking for the fact that you're following good manufacturing practices, making sure that you have some kind of food safety plan in place, making sure really that you as a company are doing what you said you're going to do to make a safe product. So the regulations are intentionally kind of broad and vague because they have to apply to so many different industries or types of food products. And so the goal is to rely on companies and their knowledge, right? Your knowledge, right? You're the experts in your product to know what it takes to make your product safely so that your consumer doesn't get sick, so that you don't have as many recalls, and that you're protected. So we also have the USDA. And in this case, right, it's like the FDA, just a different section, right? The USDA is in charge of your meat and poultry, right? And certain egg products. And the whole goal was to ensure that these specific products are made more safely. Now, if you're wondering why meat gets this special extra attention, it's because we have tended to see a lot more issues in the meat industry going way back. And there was a Jack in the Box incident with E. coli being in hamburgers that really spawned this requirement for HACCP, so that hazard analysis and critical control points for meat producers. And so when you're regulated by the USDA, you actually have somebody on site, right? While you're a regulatory agent on site while you're in production versus being regulated by the FDA. That's not happening. You might see an FDA agent every year, every 2 years, every 6 years, just depending on what level of risk your product is at, who you're selling to, and a whole host of different factors. So the FSIS is basically a branch of the USDA. And so that's who you're going to see when it comes to somebody being in your actual facility. HACCP, one of the major differences between HACCP and the foods and preventive controls for human foods is that HACCP is a globally recognized system, right? So we import tons of food, we sell tons of food overseas. So HACCP is basically what we see that the world uses as a whole as a standard. Going back and forth. And so whenever you're shipping to another country, you have to follow their standards. Likewise, if somebody's shipping to us, they need to follow our standards. So having these global programs really helps. Now, for your product in particular, and I'd love to learn a little bit more about your production if anybody wants to share. But for your product, basically, you get the FDA regulating them through cell harvesting, right? And then you get the USDA with FSIS coming after that those cells are harvested, right? So there's a very clear defining line in your process where you get one and then the other. So we'll talk a little bit about like the nuanced differences between that FDA and USDA regulation as we go through, just to help you separate like in your mind what's required in this piece of your process and what's required in the other piece of your process. So the FDA requires facilities to register every other year. USDA requires you to register before you begin manufacturing. Big difference there. You'll also notice when it comes to like paperwork requirements, the USDA requires you to review your paperwork before you actually ship. But the FDA requires you to review your paperwork within 7 working days. So you'll notice this theme, right? The difference in standards, and some are more tight than others. So we're also required to follow sanitation standard operating procedures via the USDA, and we'll get that into that in a later section. So any questions so far? Okey-doke. If you do have any questions, feel free to enter it into chat. Who can tell me in chat, or you can unmute yourself, any idea how many foreign FDA registered facilities there are out there? How many FDA registered facilities do you think are overseas?
I'll guess 30,000. I have no idea, actually.
I like that. That's a good guess. 30,000. Any other guesses?
I would say about maybe 120,000 or something.
120,000. All right.
I'm thinking 90,000.
90,000. Let's see. So 278,307. It's probably more by now because the slide is probably a couple years old. So I'm sure it's more. Which is crazy, right? 62%. That means more of our food is made outside of the US than inside. Which really is just mind-blowing, right? We see our big contributors: Japan, China, Mexico, Canada, and France. Pretty crazy. How many years do you think it would take the FDA to inspect all of those facilities?
Years for you.
Say 3.
At 20 years.
Oh. I hear you.
They'll take their time.
Mm-hmm. That they do. They've got a lot going on. Yeah. So their goal was to start out inspecting 600 facilities and then double that number in each of the following 5 years. So that's 9,600 inspections annually, which means every 28 years they get inspected. So those are really good guesses. You're spot on. The FDA, they just don't have all the resources that they need. All right, I am going to share another video with you. I need to stop that. Okay. And one more. So this is an interesting one. I'm not going to play the whole thing, but basically this guy is the co-owner of this Carl's Jr. We get to see him helping on a busy day. Yeah. So I'm not sure why or how. I'm not sure how this happens, right? But, you know, it's super busy. He's decided that he's better off mixing these things with his arms and his hands than he is using a spoon. And you notice as he's like wandering through, he's, you know, touching all kinds of things and then moves into like just getting in there. It's pretty rough. And you can see the other employees kind of trying to talk to him. They're reaching out like, hey, buddy, maybe you want to use a spoon instead of your hand.
he was challenged by some of the employees about some of these practices, and I believe responded with something like, "I'm the owner, you can deal with it." And they put up this secret camera.
I mean, smart, the employees. Yeah, they're trying to give him a spoon. And he scrapes, like, blah. So, like, whatever's on his hands, whatever's under his fingernails, getting off those excess skin cells. Then he uses a spoon to try it. And his finger. And then, if you'll notice, he pulled that from the dirty side of the 3-compartment sink to mix that. You know, just taste test it. It's fine. Yeah, and even when he has a spatula, he's like, all right, I'm going to go in with my hands still. Pretty awesome. Yeah.
The good news is when this came out and he was revealed for doing these sorts of things, he was no longer allowed to own a franchise.
Definitely grateful for that. Oh, man. Obviously, that's not a hand washing sink. Maybe one of the more minor things to worry about in this. Yeah, all kinds of cross-contamination happening here. And if we move forward, you can see where, like, he ends up dropping things on the floor and then picks them up and just serves them. 3-second rule, right? So, yeah. It's something special. All right, I think that's enough of that. You're welcome for ruining Carl's Jr. or what is it, Hardy's for you. Oh man. So the reason I showed you that is essentially to give you a good example of where foodborne illness can start, where it can come from. People mishandling products. Now, the CDC has been collecting data about illnesses, right? And they've calculated that each year, about 48 million people get sick from foodborne illness. It's about 1 in 6. The way they get their information is you go to the doctor. Your doctor finds out there's something wrong with you. They report to the CDC or the hospital, right? A lot of us get sick and never go to the doctor, right? And so these numbers are a lot lower than the actual real numbers. Basically, if you've vomited or had diarrhea, it's a good chance that you had a foodborne illness. When I look at the symptoms of foodborne illness, I like to remember just using the Pepto-Bismol song. Nausea, fever, diarrhea, vomiting, pain in your stomach. Now, this is a study that they did. They looked at what kind of products were having consistent outbreaks and at what level. And if you look, poultry is like the biggest slice of this pie. And when you think about meat processing and practices, you're basically gutting something. And the people who are working at these facilities, they're doing like the same repetitive motion over and over and over every single day. And so it's really easy to make mistakes. It's really hard to be clean in those kinds of environments. And so there's a really good chance that you might have the contents of the digestive tract, the intestines, end up on the product. And that's why we have a lot of processing around chemical baths and radiation and stuff like that. Irradiation. We also see a lot of outbreaks around leafy greens. I'm sure some of you remember the outbreaks on romaine lettuce that happened. There were like 5 of them in a row right before COVID. And that basically happened because, so in the West, where we have the Colorado River, right, we have a lot of farms where we grow our leafy greens like romaine lettuce. And we also have cattle farms, right? And poultry farms. When you think about how that system works, right, they all essentially use the Colorado River for water. And so you've got, and the way we do raise our animals, usually there are a lot of animals packed in a very tight space, in a small space. So they're basically, right next to each other. And if one of them gets sick, it gets passed around and they all tend to get sick, right? Just like people getting norovirus on a cruise ship. And so, of course, when they get sick, they're still pooping like they normally would. And if, say, they have E. coli, pathogenic E. coli, well, that poop, eventually it's going to rain. It's going to wash down to that river that they're using to water those leafy greens. It's just an easy way of contamination. E. coli can also travel on the foot of a fly. So it could land on a cow plot and then go land on your romaine lettuce and infect it. It can travel on dust in the air. It can be on farming equipment. There are just lots of different ways that this happens. And so as a result, for our leafy green incident, the FDA required that we be able to track, so we label where the romaine lettuce, so we know what farm it came from, so we can track back to the issue. It's a big part of food safety, traceability, understanding where your product was, where the ingredients came from, where they're going, where it is now, right? And then the Growers Association, they decided that they really needed to have standards around that water. So they did some remediation and then, made requirements about testing and filtration. So then, of course, beef, easy to see how that could happen. Dairy, whether you're talking about milk or eggs, right? We're required to have, or the milk industry actually voluntarily follows HACCP. So that's why they have their whole system set up, pasteurized product. So you're not allowed to send unpasteurized milk across state lines. That is illegal. Fruits and nuts, they tend to be more affected by molds. You can also see, bacterial contamination too. But for example, peanuts tend to be affected by aflatoxin. Apples tend to be affected by patulin, right? And then these are things that we eat raw. Well, depends. Sometimes we eat them raw. Sometimes they're cooked. But often things like vine tomatoes, cucumbers, we're eating those raw in our salad. And if they got infected just like the leafy greens, we have an issue. So it's a really great idea to wash your fruits and veg. Pork has a tendency to be affected by parasitic worms. Yeah, it's a fun one. So you'll notice in the meat, they can develop cysts, right? Little sacs where the worms or eggs can persist. It's pretty righteous. Do you know how you know if you have worms? Just ask your dog, right? When he's scooting across the floor. They can make your butt itch. It's fun. Of course, we also have fish. When you think about, all the things that end up in the ocean, easy temperature abuse, Yeah, all kinds of things. So how do things get contaminated? It can be contaminated by the environment they're in. It can get contaminated by incoming ingredients, by people not washing their hands, equipment and tools, right? This could be like maybe you have allergens in your facility and a tool gets used in one area and then gets brought into a different area that doesn't have that allergen. Potential cross-contamination. Air vents, right? So if an allergen or E. coli can be on the foot of a dust mite, well, dust mite might travel into those airways. So we could easily suck up whatever's in our system and send it through the airway to another part of our facility. So we have to be careful about filtration and managing these processes. Water's a big one too. We live in Asheville currently, and we are still under a boil warning after Hurricane Helene. So we cannot use our water without boiling it. All kinds of fun contaminants in there. So who can tell me what are some symptoms of foodborne illness? You remember the Pepto-Bismol song? Nausea, diarrhea, GI upset, fever. Excellent. Very nice, Gabby. And you already saw that. All right, with that, I'm going to pass it. Well, I'll do this one and then I'll pass it to Anthony. So there are prerequisite programs that are required both by FSIS and the FDA. And you'll notice the FDA is the one that requires your current good manufacturing practices, which we're about to go over. And FSIS is about your SSOPs and making sure that you have clear sanitation procedures that are going to work the way you intended them to. All right, Anthony, I'm going to pass off to you. You've got control now.
All right. So is everyone's screen changing when we're doing that? All right. Hi, guys. I don't know if you guys have seen me yet. I'm Anthony. I'm also one of the BioNetwork trainers here. We're going to be going over this next section about current good manufacturing practices. A big part of this is that good manufacturing practices are actually listed in the Federal Code of Regulations. It's known as CFR. That term comes up here in the presentation. And the whole thing about this is pretty important is that they say current good manufacturing practices, because as much as we've talked about that the FDA is very slow in its bureaucracy, but they do actually update these. So we are currently looking at this isn't just like manufacturing practices that they put in place in the 1940s and never looked at it again. They are actually continually updating these. It is basically what is general rules and requirements for how to operate. So you do have to have basic set of like proven sanitary operating in order to actually open a manufacturing facility. We're going to be going through that. Again, the big part here is that it states the minimum standards required to operate packaged food and dietary production businesses. So if the FDA comes in to inspect your building, and it's things that we'll be getting into is like if they see just like a hole in the ceiling, these are just like the minimum standards you need to be like, okay, this is a safe operating facility. So, moving along, the big things here, the CGMPs, the 4 Ps are the people, the plant, the process and procedures, and the product. So, the product itself, the process and procedures, meaning is it actually being produced in a clean and sanitary way? The plant is a very big one because as I just mentioned about the roof and the hole in it. The plant is the actual building. Are you not working in a condemned building on the extreme version of it, but are you working in a safe actual building and environment? And people is dealing with other people there who work there actually trained appropriately. And we're going to go through all these in the next couple of slides. So the big thing about this is that everybody's work impacts the quality and safety of your product. So the big thing we really want to do and why like this FFS class is really important once you're kind of getting a production company up and running is you want to set a really good standard for the work safety culture within the actual company, not just that these are our rules, but that this is the actual culture of the place. Everybody here wants to take these things seriously. They take pride in the work that they're doing, and it's not that people are feeling like they're hounded by their superiors to like keep things clean or anything. It's just that everybody is actually already working at a level through their training and knowing that keeping the facility clean is actually a major part of their job, and that everybody takes pride in that. So again, building a very strong work safety culture is a really big part of this. Your compliance is the company's compliance. So just because the company wrote down on a piece of paper that this is the procedures that it needs to operate, we were talking about Peanut Corporation of America, they probably had a bunch of documentation that said, oh yes, we completely check for salmonella and everything that we do, but they weren't actually doing it. And there were employees, not just the owners, who ended up actually going to prison over that one. That was a really extreme case, but it is a level that's showing that like your compliance is your company's compliance and also goes in the other direction. Another thing here is like knowing all the relevant procedures and processes so you can be compliant at all times. This is the thing about actually being up to date on what company, like what state or county you're operating in. Because like California has different operating procedures for manufacturing of food than other states do. But from a federal all the way down to a state and even county and town level, you need to make sure you cross all your I's and check all your T's. Because as much as we talked about how there are so many facilities, it'll take 28 years for the FDA to check everything. Not having the FDA check on you and just getting away with it isn't a very good excuse, and it's not going to work very well, especially if you end up having a recall, because then you'll get the FDA in you right away. And it's really about making sure that you're actually going through and making sure that regardless of anybody coming and checking on you, you have a good safe work, you have a good healthy safety work culture within your company, and that you're actually really trying to make sure that you are maintaining compliance at all times. Things within FSIS requires HACCP training at all levels. Me and Jeff, who's our other trainer in here in the class today, just finished a whole two-day HACCP class this week, 2 days ago. It's not too hard. It's 2 days. Big thing is that they really wanted that comes with an actual certification. This class here is something that your company will record as actual company training, and that's really good documentation. But the actual HACCP certification is the actual physical document that once you are HACCP certified, that's not just your company's, that's yours to keep moving forward, moving on. And that actually adds to a lot of actual, like, especially when we're writing out food safety plans, they want to see that there's actually HACCP certified individuals on the floor at all times. FDA is requiring food safety training and adequate to perform their job. Part of that food safety training for your company might be that they attended fundamentals of food safety class, which you guys are in right now. So FSIS is going to necessarily make sure you have at least one HACCP person on the floor at all times, but this is kind of getting into the more training that is required for FDA. So big thing here, personal hygiene. This is one of the really big ones, and it's really, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's kind of one of the more regular common sense things. But this is that, so everybody here, give me like a check mark if you've ever worked with an employee that smelled bad or didn't work with really clean clothes and you had a hard time actually saying something to them. You know, like it's just, you know, you're like this, has everybody ever had an employee that they worked with like that? These are issues that kind of, I've worked in some spots where it was all like, it wasn't a deodorant thing. It was that like this person wasn't taking a shower. This person was coming in. Like I worked in culinary world and a guy had 3 pairs of chef pants and he worked 6 days a week and he was only doing laundry 1 day a week. That's not good personal hygiene that is fit for the actual manufacturing of food products. There's our own, well, hey, I wore this shirt yesterday and then I guess I'll wear it today that we kind of do in our home practices. And we're not putting any judgment on anybody in that sense, but it's that when you're actually working in a full food manufacturing facility, much as Michelle was talking about how the tiniest little dust mite can get on something, you have the ability to scale up the problem so much faster because of the sheer like quantity of manufacturing that you're doing. When you make one sandwich at home versus say you're working in a, you know, ready-to-eat sandwich packaging company for gas stations, you might make 2,000 sandwiches over the course of a day. You know, the ability to actually spread something is just escalated to such a level that this is where they're really going to be pushing a lot of personal hygiene and personal hygiene requirements for your employees. And we're going to get into this a little bit later on, but this also leads into things that are dealing with, you know, like having beard nets and hair nets and making sure that everybody is, and again, coming in and actually having it, because there are companies that actually have it to where they actually buy you 2 sets of clothes, and you have a locker room, and even to the point of your socks and shoes, when you come in, you do a full change, and those clothing is actually washed in-house, and you don't ever actually have your actual street clothes coming into the actual production facility. Sort of more higher end extreme version, but a lot of things like that happen in things like, say, the pharmaceutical industry. Again, getting into personal hygiene, you want to have a set of practices. You want to make sure that everybody is just basically coming in. You don't want, the big part of this is that if people come in and they're sick or they're dirty or they were dealing with other people, and a lot of this deals with people having to know that you need to wash your hands a lot of the time. Some people don't wash their hands as much. They cough into their hands, they wipe it on their coat sleeve, and they kind of keep moving. Having these good habits built into the trainings of everybody who's in there, and that it doesn't need to seem like you're picking on anybody. It doesn't need to seem like you're being mean or talking down to anybody or talking to someone like they're in preschool about washing their hands, but it's just that these are the standard practices and the standards that we're holding ourselves to within our actual operation facility and our production levels. And again, this kind of goes into like, you don't want to see dirty pants. You don't want to be seeing like a stain that was on somebody's shirt is still there the next day. Because these things are showing that like the clothing isn't quite getting clean, because we go out into the outside world and we come into contact with, there's so much traffic, and I say traffic and just all the different things that come in contact with us in the outside world that we don't want to be bringing into the food manufacturing facility. The thing down here too is also on the covering of wounds. A wound sounds like a very, like somebody's bleeding profusely or is stabbed, but a blister is a wound. If somebody's working in a manufacturing facility and they're doing a lot of repetitive action with their hands, they might develop a blister on their hands. They need to get that covered up. It's a little thing that like people say, oh, there's a little tiny scab on my knuckle. And then and it's almost healed up. Well, you still need to get it covered up, because the fact of the matter is that when it turns into the possibility of an open wound, even the tiniest little thing has the ability to transmit biological and hazards to the food. Any questions really kind of about what we're getting into here with this? It really is about enforcing, but trying to, again, it's easier to, when you start out. Because we worked in a facility, we did some classes for a CIF facility that was switching to an organic food product. Initially, it was just making packaging materials, but they weren't for food products. So they didn't have all of these standards in place because it wasn't all considered food grade. So they had a bunch of, legacy workers who would come in working in a somewhat dirty factory that they then had to try to enforce a lot more hygiene practices on that had never had to deal with that. And some of them had been there for 5 to 10 years. And it was a real struggle for them because people were feeling attacked. People were saying, well, why do I need to do this now? But when you set these standards ahead of time and everybody knows what the deal is and what the expectations are moving in, you're going to get a lot more positive response from your employees out of it. So does anybody in the chat, give me a check mark, does anybody know what this is that's on this person's hand? I guess it says there. Yeah, this hand is in fact, sorry, this question used to be a question. This is what's known as hand, foot, and mouth disease, and this comes from, the cause being contaminated by fecal matter. And it is contagious once you have it on you. You don't want to be around other people. This is basically kind of like similar to like a chicken pox. And it can be gross. And the problem is that a lot of people think, oh no, well, a lot of this comes from just not washing your hands. Simply put, a lot of this comes from not washing your hands. We use so many restrooms that other people use, and we don't have any control over when other people do and do not wash their hands and what surfaces they touch. This is why we need to be very, very aware of how often, anytime we're moving into and out of these spaces, especially in the food manufacturing area, that we're washing our hands. There was a brewery that ended up having a lot of people come and get that I worked at, where 2 different people ended up getting this. And they generally had good, clean manufacturing practices, but I think it was the fact that the only bathroom in the building was in the tap room. So as much as we were having our own clean manufacturing practices back in the brewery side, the only bathroom we had to use was the one that the open general public was using. So I don't think anybody in that facility wasn't not washing their hands properly, but I think they were picking stuff up from, again, the human traffic of the patrons through the tap rooms. The thing about this is getting into uniforms. Uniforms protect the food and you. Uniform doesn't always necessarily need to be a standard processing code. It could just be saying that a uniform could be no shorts, no sandals, no ankle socks. no collared shirts sometimes because they say that the buttons, like this here, they say the buttons could possibly become a hazard. Uniforms themselves are very important. Again, they do need to make sure that they're clean and that they're actually fitting to the sanitary requirements. Tank tops are generally not allowed in food manufacturing facilities due to the fact of they're saying like the open of like the sweat and the armpits and the shoulders, that they want to have all of that covered. It's not trying to be judgmental on anyone. It's just safe manufacturing practices. And a lot of times manufacturing facilities get very hot and people complain about the uniforms in summer. They're all like, I want to wear a tank top and shorts and sandals, but that's not what you can be wearing to be safely manufacturing food for the general public. It's good to be wearing that if you're doing a barbecue in your backyard, but that's really kind of the level that we're getting to here is we are working in a high production, industrial level of food production. If you need to wear disposable, there's things like that. Like anything that says it's a disposable coat people need to be aware that you just need to change them. Sometimes it's like a lot of times with like rubber gloves, people want to say, I can just wash my gloves after I've coughed on them. No, they're disposable gloves. You need to take your gloves off. You need to wash your hands again. And what we're getting into with these current manufacturing practices is talking about, these are just the standards of what people want to see happening with good training and making sure that you have set good, clean, standard operating procedures for your facility. Any questions so far? Is everybody doing all right? I've kind of been talking a lot here at y'all for a second. All right, cool. Getting into hairnets and beer guards, this is kind of a thing I like to tell people is that unfortunately there's just really no room for fashion in food safety. This is going to go into also with fake eyelashes, fake nails. This you need to have your beard, your hair. People say, well, my beard isn't that short. It's only that. It's just those are the operating procedures that they're saying are the standard and need to be held. Everyone who has facial hair, mustaches, beards, goatees, they need to wear a beard and a face guard. Generally, when it comes to jewelry, there's usually about one wedding band that's allowed, and that's it. But getting into with the beard and hairnet and beard guards. So, actually, Michelle, do you see there that it says bear guards? You do want to protect your facility against bears at all times.
Yes.
They are not known to be particularly clean creatures, and also are very disruptive towards authoritarian figures. But beards as well must be covered. All right. So you guys can feel to go and unmute yourselves for a second here, or you can type into the chat. Is my arrow visible on the screen?
I don't see yours, but I'll put mine up.
Yeah, we do the arrows for me here. So we're going to go over, give us actually a check mark if you think we're going to go through all these. Give me a green check mark if you think that these are beard nets that are being worn appropriately. So we got our first one here.
So is this hairnet being worn correct?
I'm seeing some X's. I got 3 X's. Do we have any more?
Yeah, we're getting some no's in chat too.
Yep. Yeah, so that one is not being worn correctly. We have the hair on the back of the neck. That is not fully covered. It is over the ears, which is good, but they still have some of the back that is not being covered. So let's go on to the next one. What do we think on this one? Yeah, we're getting the nose again. Yeah. Where he's missing that. He's not wearing he's got the beard net on, but he's not covering his mustache. This is sort of like when people were putting the masks on in COVID and just putting them on their chins, not even covering their mouth and nose. Being like, there, I've protected my chin. So let's go on to the next one. What do you think of this one? We got some greens. Yeah, somebody's actually doing this correctly. This one is correct. This guy here, this is a little bit of a trickier one. What do we think on this one? So I'm seeing some yeses. I'm seeing some no's. Let's see what the chat is here.
Has to prove medically bald.
So I believe he does not have a mustache in this photo, but unfortunately, or I don't say unfortunately, it's just the nature of it is that you do need to have the top. If you're bald, you still need to have a beard net on. And a part of that is dealing with sweat There's more likely for sweat to come off the top of your head and possibly so unfortunate. So that is actually, he is still not fully correct in that. We'll go on to the next one here.
Yeah, just real quick, the FDA does require, even if you're bald, you have to wear a hairnet.
Yeah, you have to wear a hairnet if you are bald. So let's go with this guy. Yeah. So somebody in chat, does anybody know what's wrong with this one? Somebody can write it in chat.
You're not allowed to have it adulterated in any way, like tied in a knot.
Yeah. I'm not sure if that is tied in a knot or if that's just the way the neck came, but I'm going to go with that one. But also, it's not down over his ears. But also, yeah, I never actually thought about that with that one. I think he has tried to tie that one up like a knot. Thank you. I'm not going to lie. I've done this class like 6 times. I have never actually thought of that one. Thank you so much. That's awesome. All right, so let's go to the happiest looking guy we have here. Does he look like he's wearing it correctly? We got some green check marks for this one. Billy Mays here. Yeah. So this guy, despite his angry look, he is actually wearing it correctly. He has his nose, he has his ears covered. And then we'll go on to the next one. The eyebrows, huh? That... So I will say that, so this one is being worn correctly. Having it over your eyebrows, that could be a company policy. It is not necessarily an FDA regulation. So much with the bald guy, he has to wear a hairnet due to FDA regulation, but he doesn't have to have it over his eyebrows. Your company can always, have even higher restrictions than the FDA. To the point, as long as they don't get into levels of like prejudice, then it is actually fully up to their discretion. They could say that you have to wear a full mask, at all times. That is up to their discretion on that. But the FDA is not going to come in and say, hey, cover your eyebrows up. But they will say, why is the bald guy not wearing his hairnet? So I think we can see the guy down there with the beard net. He's the same as the guy before. We saw that he wasn't wearing his correctly. But then we go to the other guy, the last one there. Does this guy look like he's wearing his correctly? We have some greens, some X's. Yes, this guy has been wearing his correctly. And I know this might be a little a little tedious on this, but this is kind of the different levels that we've all seen people trying to wear stuff in their way in the things. I like to think of that guy there as the same guy who was wearing his correctly before. He just shaved and felt better and got a haircut. So, but that is the proper use of hairnets. I was talking about this. Jewelry is not supposed to be worn on premise. This is really getting into, they do have some regulations that say you can have one wedding band, but even those can be dangerous on more of an OSHA safety hazard aspect. A big part of this is that they don't want small pieces of debris to fall into this is more dealing with they don't want it to become a physical hazard for food that could possibly fall in. There are always little stones that could, and a ring or an earring could fall off into the food. Cell phones, pagers, and cameras are prohibited. We're going to get into a few more slides here, but I'm going to spoil the ending. Our little electronic devices are just harbingers of pathogenic bacteria. They're not very clean. They are not clean food contact surfaces in any way. So this here was somebody did some plating. They took the cell phone and they put it face down onto a gel, and then they did a bacterial growth. And we can see here where the start button, where everybody's usually, if we can get an arrow on that, let's see here. Do I have yeah, we have our little arrows here, and then we can see that this person here was using probably you can see where their apps that they were most likely to be using were. This person was a lot more busy, but it's always there. They have the start button here and that. So here's a question for everybody. When we all go to the restroom, we wash our hands. Who here has ever used their phone in the restroom? And, I'll be the first to put a green check mark off. Yeah, it's a very common practice. It's kind of the new newspaper daily reader. A lot of people don't take smoke breaks because they don't smoke, and they use a restroom break in manufacturing facilities to go then catch up on emails, catch up on texts, things like that. So let's take the green checks down. Who here washes their phone after leaving the restroom, after washing their hands? Do we have some yeses? Well, good on you if you're actually one of the folks that are actually doing that. But that's kind of the key thing is a lot of people go in, they sit in the restroom, possibly in a stall, and they go and look up things on their phone, and then they put the phone back in their pocket. So now, and it's just that you're not in the most sterile environment. Somebody else who was in that restroom before you was not washing their hands while they were in the stall. They were doing it after they were there. So that cleans. I'm not going to go into too many details here because we don't need to be grossed out, but we know what's going on in restrooms, and there is fecal matter in the air. And Michelle likes to talk about this thing called the toilet sneeze. And that is that when you don't have the lid down, and most, open public restrooms or toilets in manufacturing facilities don't have toilet lids. They just have seats. When you flush the toilet, there is a little bit of a misted explosion, which sends stuff flying up into the air around you. And it's called the toilet sneeze. And that's how a lot of fecal matter gets up into the air. So a lot of that stuff can get on the cell phone. It goes into people's pockets, and then they wash their hands. But then they go back out on the floor, and then they probably go and sneak out into the, maybe they go on break, or they're just go and take a sneak look at their phone. And there could be bacteria now harboring on their phone, which they're bringing into the production area. So something to keep in mind. We're not saying that you shouldn't be looking at your phones, but you need to keep them out of the manufacturing area because they really are gross, and people aren't taking a lot of time to clean them. Eating and smoking, a big part of this. With smoking, it's that, this is a lot of debris. With smoking is, if anybody needs to smoke, that's fine. We're not getting in any judgment on smoking. But it is a activity that requires you putting your hand to your mouth and then breathing in and then breathing out on your hand. And there's a lot of bacteria that is spread around through that. So if you go out and have a cigarette, you need to make sure you go and wash your hands before you come back in. And it goes just the same for vaping. And it needs to be done outside because you're breathing out that stuff into the environment. And a lot of times with vaping, people think that they can vape inside. A lot of vaping is oil-based. So you're breathing out oil, which can then even stick to surfaces a lot easier and is a little bit even harder to clean out. So just make sure that if you are smoking, you really need to have good proper hygiene when you are washing your hands when you're getting back to work. Big part of the thing with food, you don't want food in the production area because there's crumbs, but it can lead to a lot of pests. There can lead to you actually getting your own bacteria from something and crumbs falling out of your mouth into the food. But another part is that you're creating food and bugs will get into anywhere. They really will. I don't know how they have. I'm not an entomologist. I don't know what the nose of a rat is like, but they know how to find food. And if you leave enough food around and little tiny crumbs and stuff like that, that is how you get real bad pest infestation problems. And those will bring all kinds of biological hazards into your facility. And you don't want those in there. And it's a really important thing to have very specific areas set aside for your food areas. And having very strong, they were be very strict about it. If I know that, I would come into work, I was on a night shift at a brewery, and they said, hey, we found a Snickers wrapper. Just simply finding a wrapper, they would come and get in trouble for that. Even if they didn't catch anyone eating it, they're like, well, I was just emptying out my pockets. So it doesn't matter. You can't have food wrappers out on the production floor because then we have to assume that there's food out there. And then we now have to go and perform an extra action to check for pests and spray for pests in the area. It was pretty strict on it. It was very important that we actually keep our cell phones clean, keep our cell phones off the production floor. We're not eating, and we're definitely not smoking inside. We're getting into this kind of what I was talking about, fake eyelashes and fake nails, but this also goes into the deal with a lot of production facilities saying you're not supposed to be having heavy makeup on. There are limits to the production facility actually saying your own limits of what level of makeup you can and cannot have. but they are considered a chemical hazard. A big part of it is that in production facilities, people are working, they're sweating. They could be touching their face, but they could also be sweating it out. And there could be allergens, and it is considered a chemical hazard if you end up sweating off makeup and it drips into the food. There were times that a lot of times with perfumes. We know a story of that it was a ham packing. They were basically vacuum sealing Christmas hams. And there was an employee who just wore so much rose water perfume that they ended up, QA went and opened up one of the hams and it smelled like the perfume because it was transferring over into the hams. It's again, like I was saying, there just isn't any room for fashion in the food manufacturing facility, in food safety. We all want to look our best. We all want to, but like we want to get dressed up and feel good and look nice. We need to make sure we're trying to do that out in the public work area, and that what we're really doing is just looking clean and safe in the actual production facility. And that goes again with hairnets. We can't be having as nice of a hairstyles as maybe we would like. It's just the nature of how it goes. A lot of things with lotions that people put on hands can have allergens in them. They could be based in peanut oil or sesame oil sometimes, and we don't know what's in those things. And those can easily get sweated out, and we just really don't want to have that form of cross-contamination within the facility. And this can get into the thing where we want everybody to have good hygiene, but we can also tell, again, sometimes you can tell people you're wearing way too much perfume to the point that it's becoming a chemical hazard. It's not the best way to put it, but it is the nature of why it needs to be addressed sometimes. So, someone in chat, can you guys tell me about how specifically you guys feel that hairnets should be worn? Do we have anyone in chat? Okay. Yep. Cool. All right. Good job, guys. So, yeah, as much as it might not be the most enjoyable experience, this guy's not having a fun time with it, but this is the proper way. This is kind of getting into when we're talking about with the open wounds. If you see someone, this one here is talking about what we have here is here. This was, a fast photo taken of like when people sneeze, why you need to cover your face. It flies out of your mouth and your nose at a very high velocity and spreads a lot further than you think. If people are coming into work and you have a fever, that is usually the predecessor to, unless you just went and ate a whole bunch of spicy hot wings at lunch, there is something sick. And when you have a fever, you're generally at your most contagious. If somebody's coming in and they have a fever, the company needs to be able to have things in place, and employees need to know that person needs to not be there. They need to go home. They need to get well. They need to take care of themselves. But if somebody's coming in with a fever, that is generally a predecessor to some form of a disease that they have that can possibly spread to the workplace. A part of that is that you don't want to get the rest of your employees sick because we're putting in all of these safety regulations and people are operating the facility safely and doing their job. And you're trying to keep track of each person is probably responsible for two to three different things that are keeping the facility running safe at all times. And if somebody comes in and gets half of your workforce sick, now you have people doing 3 times as many things, and you're opening you up for that much more potential for human error. And you do want to keep your employees safe. That we do want to have empathy and keep people safe. Another part of it is we were talking about with open wounds. If it is a blister, if it is a bleeding cut, you need to make sure that there are band-aids. Is the band-aid being changed is a big one. Has anyone here ever put a band-aid on a thumb and then left it on there for 4 days? Do we have any green checks or anything? But it's a thing that people will put on a Band-Aid and they'll be like, cool, I'm just going to leave that on until it's healed. But that is still a wound and a bandage that needs to be changed out daily, if not every time you wash your hands, because that Band-Aid is generally going to soak up a lot of water and bacteria in it. You're going to carry that around with you, and it's going to be counteractive to the purpose that it's actually serving. And keeping away from the fact that said, keeping hands away from the mouth and the nose. Moms are always saying, stop touching your face, but it's a real thing. You need to make sure that if you wipe your nose, you need to go wash your hands again. It's just these kind of sort of things that they're really looking for. This is kind of what I was just talking about, where if somebody's coming in and they're not feeling well, you should feel okay going and reporting it to the manager, not feeling like you're ratting someone out, but having actual concern, being like, hey, Tom was really sick and I think he might have gone and thrown up in the bathroom. He needs to get off the floor. He can't be here right now. And you need to be able to take time. And like I said, having a good work safety culture built, everybody should know and be comfortable and go like, I do not feel well. I should not be here, regardless of we're trying to meet a certain deadline or anything like that. Employee health is really got to come first, and people need to feel comfortable in being, I need to take a day off. I can't be here. And management needs to be comfortable in approaching people and saying, hey, you have a fever. We cannot have you here today. You need to go home until you feel better. And these are really important things. Keeping the fingernails clean and trimmed, that's getting into having good personal hygiene, But a big part of it is really if somebody's coming into work and they're not feeling well, that everybody's able to actually recognize it, adjust it, and in a non-confrontational way, have them leave the facility and do what's best for them and the actual company themselves to actually take care of themselves, and everybody else be okay with the fact that somebody's going to be missing for the day. Getting into a lot of things with hand washing, this is a big thing where people can feel like they're being talked down to sometimes, and it really isn't. We're not saying that anybody doesn't know how to wash their hands or they're not doing it enough. It's just that the hand washing versus what you do at home or out in public life versus what you're doing in a facility. In a facility, it's the same as it's an industrial process is what it needs to be looked at. This is the same sort of, way that we're cooking our meat. This is the same way that we are having extra steps to perform sanitary actions on our production line. Your hands are considered a food contact surface, and they need to be given the same treatment. It needs to be treated. They have to be saying we are going to be make sure we're scrubbing our hands for 30 seconds, for 20 seconds. Everyone needs to be washing your hands. You need to have proper hand washing stations available within your facility so everybody can wash their hands whenever they need to. But letting everyone know that, yes, you have to take the extra time to do it. You have to use the proper methods that we're showing you. We're going to be showing, because they're showing here in the picture here all the different areas that they want you to specifically scrub and make sure you get. But it's done because when you're in the production facility, your hands are basically what are going to be touching everything else. There's so much traffic of items and surfaces that pass through your hands that you have to clean them on an industrial level versus what you might do at home or in the public world. Michelle, I'm going to pass it off to you for a second here to show a little quick video about what we're talking about.
Thank you. Right. Just a quick hand washing video.
How to wash your hands properly. You've got clean hands. For up-to-date information about COVID-19, visit health.mn.gov.
Sorry about that. Let me turn that off. Okay. Bring it back to you, Anthony.
Thank you. So I didn't quite go over this quite as much, but a big part of this is people are saying, can hand antiseptic, can just using hand sanitizer, what do you guys think? Can hand sanitizer be used in place of just thoroughly washing your hands? You think yes or no? I'm liking seeing all these X's popping up. Yes, correct. That I always like to tell people that you got to look at it like if I was working on a car and I got my hands all oily from car grease. And I just go and put hand sanitizer. Is it going to get all that car grease off my hands? And am I now good to go make myself a sandwich? It's kind of the same system. The actual hand washing is going to be removing physical particulates, and the sanitizer is going to be actually cleaning out your hands on a biological level. And you want as clean of a smooth of a surface in order to get sanitizer to work. That's the same way that you have to do proper cleaning and then sanitization. They always call it clean and sanitize, because you want to be removing all of the physical debris that you possibly can off of the surface before you then hit it with the biological killing sanitary methods. Yep. So we just kind of went through that. We had a teacher who told us if you could find a way to sanitize dirt, you'd be a billionaire overnight. Outside of like a thermal blowtorch, I can't think of any way that you'd actually be able to do that, and that's not a very safe or practical measure. And a lot of times when you do that, you end up spraying, butane fumes onto things as well, so it still has the nature to cause a contamination. So getting into this, we were talking about the plants, getting into your actual physical facility here. This picture here was actually taken by an FDA inspector. You can actually see their badge right here. This was a tofu manufacturing company, and somebody had gone in and left the rinsing colander in the employee restroom. Now, the employee restroom itself is not looking very clean as it is. This was their soap. And if you see down here, you can see that they were actually also storing onions in their employee restroom. So there's a whole lot of issues that were happening here, and they weren't operating a very safe plant. They weren't giving anybody a good ability to actually operate in a safe facility. This is getting into like the building, the grounds, meaning the actual area around the facility. What is your company next to? Is there any way for anything outside of it to get in? Contact services is dealing a lot with, like, would you ever see an old butcher's block that's made out of wood and it's full of all kinds of chips and divots in it? That's not a very clean surface because bacteria can live into those nooks and crannies, and it's very, very hard, if not impossible, to get them out of it. So we'll be going into detail about these. Getting into here. A big part here is thinking about, like, we were talking about hand washing stations. Hand washing stations need to be put practically around your facility. You need to have your facility set up in a full, like, that there's actually, like, getting down here is with, like, the proper facility design. Is there a means so that you are not actually receiving and driving forklifts past your actual production area? Do people have an ability to go, if they need to wash their hands, and get to a hand washing station quickly? Or do they have to cross over into multiple different areas before they can wash their hands? You don't want to have your restroom being the only place where employees are actually able to wash their hands, because now they're traveling into one of the most possibly contaminated areas in order to get their hands clean. Also, if people are having to change in and out of gowns, you want to be able to have them not have to do that because they have to cross over into, say, a specific area, then cross back into a sanitary area. Just kind of logically trying to think about how that everybody has the means to do what you're asking them to do. Outside access, how easy is anybody able to leave and enter your building? And are they able to do so in a sanitary way? So that, is there a changing station if they're already gowned up, so that nobody goes and gets all gowned up, steps outside for have a cigarette out into the open environment, and then walks back into the building, therefore negating any of the actual sanitary actions that you put in place before that. Toilet facilities need to be clean. You need to make sure you're having good, clean sanitary operations within your facility. We've been talking about water supply. This is a really big issue for a lot of companies here in Asheville, because a lot of places, have power and they have employees and they even have customers that want to work for them. But unfortunately, they can't operate because they don't have clean water supply, and they can't make that guarantee. Potable water is a very, very big, important aspect to a lot of the food manufacturing industry, especially with sanitary and cleaning. If you are rinsing even if it's not going into the food, if you're rinsing your machinery off with non-potable water, you are potentially using a lot of bacteria to basically coat your facility in that. So there's a lot of things that are going on here that are wrong with this. This was a real photo taken of a toilet in a bathroom in a production facility. But luckily it was back in 2002, and I believe they've gotten their stuff together, or this company's no longer in business, one or the other. I like this photo because it actually presents, as weird as it could be, an opportunity here. So, if I'm going to kind of throw this out to the chat real quick, what could we do to actually bring this bathroom up to code? Because it wouldn't take as much as you might think. I know that there's initially you say we should just burn this whole facility down based on how gross it looks. Yep, bulldozer could be one thing. Clean it, yeah. So this is the soap that they're using. So I like that. New soap, covered trash can. So for new soap, we could say maybe we would put a soap dispenser over here that's like hands off, do a covered thing there. Probably do some cleaning on the floor, do some basic cleaning on it. And it's just that, this wouldn't need to be a full shut your facility down, but if you put a soap dispenser up, it's kind of hard to see because it blends into the floor. There's a plunger over here. You'd want to put that into a little sealed container of some kind. But some very basic CGMPs could actually turn this system around. But what's interesting about this is to show that, this didn't get to this level overnight. This is a level of degradation that happened due to neglect. And that is what happens when you don't have your proper CGMPs in place when you're getting started, when you don't have a good work safety culture, good healthy one, that people just let things get to this level. And then it becomes and then until it becomes a major problem. And that's the thing, is we're really trying, it's not just that, CGMPs, when you have this good foundation of how you're going to operate your facility, when you're getting yourself up and running, you maintenance and actually having everybody aware. If somebody comes in and says, hey, the bathroom looks gross, somebody needs to get there and clean it. Employee complaints are valid in these things. You have to use these restrooms. You need to say, hey, you want me to operate in a clean, safe facility, but you're not giving me, we're running out of toilet paper every other day. You need to voice these things and make sure that everybody's okay and comfortable with actually maintaining the status quo that you're saying you want to have. And so then you don't end up with the FDA coming in and finding, and then then your toilet doesn't get immortalized in the fundamentals of food safety video till the end of time. So getting here is kind of what we're trying to figure out is you want to, the big thing here, everything needs to be written down and it needs to be standardized. You want to make sure that you're covering your bases from the receiving all the way through to the finished goods and storage. You want to know that you are actually a master of your actual castle, of your building. You know exactly what's coming in and exactly how it's handled through every step of the process that is in place. And that by your entire company, that you have standardized operating procedures so that everybody's doing things the exact same way. Because not everyone's going to be on the same shift. People are not going to see each other. If someone's passing training on to someone else, it doesn't need to be just from their personal experience. It needs to be based on the standards you've set forth. The big thing we like to say is that if it isn't written down, it didn't happen. And that is especially relevant for when you're having FDA inspections. Because you can claim that you're doing a lot of stuff, but the FDA is coming in to essentially collect evidence against you. That is their job, to come in and collect and build a case against you for problems you might have. And so you want to be building your own evidence and you have a case for yourself to say that, yes, we are operating a clean and safe manufacturing facility. So this here is a picture. We're talking about our ingredients. What do we think? Does anybody have an idea what this is that we're looking at over here? And I'm going to give you a hint. It's not garbage.
Is it food?
It is food. This is a tortilla chip company or a pita chip company. And this is how their product was packaged and shipped to their customers. What sort of problems do we see here? Feel free to answer in the chat any problems you see. Maybe there's none. Good, excellent. There's nothing you don't want to make. I've never seen a clean pallet. Label, fantastic. I have no idea. We have no idea what this is, what ingredients are in it. Packaging is torn. I've seen mice in buildings that had chewed through drywall. There's something getting into this bag to eat something there. Packaging is torn. We don't have a good label. Nobody knows what's on these. There's no labeling forms. Somebody said the wood. I've never seen a clean pallet in my life. I don't know if anybody's actually made a brand new pallet since like the 1970s. I think they all just get sent around to different forms of rotation. Like pallets are sent to any building. There's no segregation from them. You always want to have some sort of a like liner of some kind separating them from the product themselves. The product itself could be being damaged through this packaging. So this is neither safe nor quality. And this is not a good way that you want to be handling things. Packaging and labeling is really important, especially on the safety side of things, because you want to know that what kind of ingredients are in it, what the expiration dates are on it. Also good for tracing and traceability, so that if there is, for whatever reason, some sort of a recall, that you can go and find it. Also for labeling that there could be allergens, which is a really huge thing. I would say the number one reason for recalls right now in the United States is because mislabeling on the product. And recalls are expensive. Even if they're a quick, easy one, they're still always going to be expensive. But a lot of times people are mislabeling allergens and they have to do a full recall. And that is considered a major food safety hazard, because if somebody's not aware of an allergen in a food, you have to assume that it could be a lethal allergic reaction. You can't assume that, well, people might just get a stomach ache from a little bit of a milk allergy. You have to assume that it's going to be a lethal allergy because of the level of just the scale of how manufacturing is now, the sheer level of contacts that you have through customers to your product. It's far more likely for you to actually end up with someone with a lethal reaction to your product getting to it if they don't read the label correctly. The big thing here is any healthy claims, nutrition, or other promotional statements must be truthful and non-misleading. Michelle, do you want to talk a little bit more about that one? Michelle?
Essentially, what they're saying is you can't make like false statements. Like some products will say, this is gonna cure your diabetes, or it's anti-inflammatory. You can't make those statements unless they've been scientifically proven. And so,
lose weight. That's a huge one on products right now. Like saying you like have a healthy diet, and if you do these other things, maybe you could have a weight loss. But actually claiming for it to be a actual cause for weight loss is a really huge issue and a gray area that a lot of people are like flirting around with their product.
Yeah, so it's something to think about with your product. What is the accurate way to portray this product, and to also, have and be positive advertising for you, right? So it'll be interesting. And you also have to have those safe handling instructions too, because I'm sure it's a product that's relatively new for customers. So there'll be some questions going into like what they're supposed to actually do or how they're supposed to manage it.
So we've been talking a lot here about we've been talking about our personnel. We've been talking about our actual plants and our facilities, the actual product itself. Is it labeled correctly? Is it being made and stored practically? Because we were looking at those pita chips. And we're also talking about our processes and procedures. That are we actually performing our tasks in a safe and sanitary way within our facility? And that's really kind of what we're getting across here with this section. So with that in mind, in the chat, why don't you guys type out for me, what are the 4 Ps of the CGMPs? I see people. Good. We got 3 more. People, plant, product. All right, we got 3. How are we making our product? Processes. Yes, processes and procedures. They're interchangeable. So there we go. Good job, guys. All right. Michelle, do we want to do this video or keep rolling?
I'll do it really quick.
All right, I'm going to hand this over to Michelle. I think we should be able to get through this next section by noon.
Yeah, I think so.
Just a little bit over, and then we'll take a little break.
It's from one of us, and they skimp on the portion.
portions.
It's messed. Clock it out, suckers. Clock it out, suckers.
Lucky. You gonna order food?
I don't know. Whenever I order anything lately, they don't make it right.
Yeah, they see it's from one of us and they skimp on the portions.
It's messed up. Just because we get an employee discount doesn't mean they should make it smaller and here.
You see what everybody's doing at Chipotle now? Filming them while they make it?
Oh yeah, to make sure they get a full burrito or whatever?
Yeah, because people are sick of being ripped off and they're posting now.
Good for them.
You should do that here.
Do what here?
Ring in your order, then go film the kitchen while they make it. Put a little pressure on them.
That is brilliant.
Yeah, that is. Just do it.
Oh, I'm doing it. Drop me a Santa Fe chicken. Hey, for Aaron. Hey.
Actually, don't drop that. I'll just use this fucked up chicken breast I couldn't sell.
Didn't I cook that 3 hours ago?
Yeah, so?
What the are you doing? A little quality control? Go ahead. Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah? You want to film me cooking your food? Film this, asshole. Oh. How about I follow you around to your tables, filming you f***ing up every order, huh? You like that? Huh? Hey, never mind. Sorry.
Aaron, keep going. You're doing full Chipotle on you, man.
Clock.
All right. Back to you.
All right, so kind of getting into like other prerequisite programs. That these are ones that once we were talking about having, your basic basic sanitary safe work culture that we're trying to build there, and our good proper current manufacturing practices. This is getting into the legal side of these are programs that are required by U.S. law. You need to have proper sanitation performance standards, FSIS, and sanitary operating procedures. The big thing here, you need to be clearly describing the procedures that prevent direct contamination of adulteration of product. So then when people hear about adulteration of product, I'm going to ask a question here, looking for some green check marks. Has anybody heard about the Boar's Head recall that's happening right now? Or basically it has happened, and now they're dealing with the aftermath of it. Has anybody heard about this? Well, the big thing about it was that there was a listeria outbreak within their products that was found. And part of the reason of the recall and some of the legal action that's being taken against them is that the product is being considered an adulterated product. That is not to say, when a lot of people think this is the kind of term where people say adulteration versus intentional adulteration. Intentional adulteration might be if somebody is selling you olive oil and they're cutting it with regular canola oil to save money. That's like an intentional adulteration. An adulteration is that there is something in the product that isn't supposed to be there and you didn't have labeled. So the fact that they didn't have listeria, which is what it was being recalled for having, the fact that listeria wasn't listed on their label, because nobody would ever want to put listeria on their label, is considered an adulterated product and therefore had to be recalled for that, like getting into the actual like legalese of it. But we want to get into like separating biological, chemical, and physical hazards or all possible adulterations that could be in your food. And they want to make sure that you have actual practices set up in place to remove these hazards. And a hazard is identified as anything that has the potential to cause human harm to the public health system. So getting into the differences between quality versus safety, quality would be that if, say, you were selling Pringle cans and all of your cans were going out half full, that's not a hazard. That is not a risk to public health safety, because the risk is that you just got ripped off and you don't have all the Pringles you said you had. But if there was salmonella in the potatoes that was going out into the Pringle cans, now you have a hazard, because now there's potential for people to actually get sick from consuming your product. And that is kind of what they're getting at. They want to see that they have these actual properly reviewed SSOPs and proper records and direct observation and testing to make sure that the hazards that you've identified, because we're going to get into a whole hazard analysis section that Jeff is going to talk about. But FSIS wants to see robust hazard programs and hazard analysis to prove that you say that there is no actual harm to the public by selling your product. Let's see what we got here. They want to see kind of like getting into all these things like they want to see a lot of signed and dated documentation. They want to know that kind of like with the what and how. They want to see a written actual description of what your product, that you actually have a written description of what your product is and how you're making it. So you're not just saying, well, we're making chicken soup. Well, how do you make it? Oh, we just put some stuff together. No, they want to see they have a very specific understanding of what your product is and how you are actually proceeding it They want to know that who's actually signing off on all of your decision making, and are they qualified individuals? Is it somebody who even works there? Did you have a consultant come in to get yourself set up with a safety plan, sign off on everything, and now they don't actually work at the facility anymore? They want to know that there's people there who are actually observation, people that are actually there qualified to be operating and making the decisions and manufacturing everybody. And they also want to know that how often you're actually doing testing and actually how often you're actually taking time to observe that the hazards are being controlled within your facility. Big part of this is dealing with monitoring. This is dealing with monitoring the actual operations. This is dealing with record keeping. This is going on with your employees themselves being fully trained in what to look for and what it's sort of monitoring they're actually and record keeping they're supposed to be having. And then all of these things can be done within a real-time place. And that they're actually seeing that you guys are holding them to that standard. So you're not seeing people say, oh, well, someone forgot to fill out the log. Well, I know what they did. I saw it. I'll fill out the log for them. They want to see nice, clean, neat record keeping within your facility. The big thing about this is food contact surfaces. Everything here is considered a food contact surface. Hands is a big one. You need to make sure that your hands are covered. Conveyor belt lines. You don't want to see dings. Things here, this is one that I see a lot because if anybody who's ever worked in like restaurants, these fall and crack and have all kinds of these need to be intact. They don't want to see dinged up, cracked, even if it is technically still functional. When you have beat up, damaged equipment, that presents a hazard in the eyes of the FDA, and they want to see those things replaced, even on the smallest level. Using only approved cleaning and sanitizing materials. If you're using a material, it needs to be labeled as food grade, that you're actually supposed to be using it, and that you're not using some industrial oil rig cleaner to clean your facility. Everything needs to be listed as food grade. Things like this. Do not be using floor brushes, brooms, squeegees on food contact surfaces. If there's a brush that you use on the line, that brush also needs to not get used on the floor. When I was working in the brewing industry, we had to clean tanks. Those things are 3 stories tall sometimes. We had very long poles, which weren't allowed to touch the ground for scrubbing the sides of those. And we had separate brushes that were used for cleaning the floor. And when we caught someone accidentally using one on the floor, it immediately got taken out of rotation and wasn't allowed to touch the tanks anymore. These are the sort of things that they're looking for to make sure that you're actually paying attention to what your food contact surfaces is and what you're actually even using to clean them. Non-food contact surfaces. This is a big one here is drainage. There's cracks in the floor. This is a very key area. Drains is a huge area where you can have bacterial growth. Drains are never going to be 100% clean. It's just the nature of how it is because they are taking away the waste off the floor out of the facility. But you need to make sure that your drains are set up so that they're not actually pooling. Sometimes I've seen drains where they were set up and they were 1.5 inches off of the actual ground and therefore not actually being of any use. You want to make sure that listeria itself likes to grow in puddles. It loves to grow in moisture. So if you're having improper drainage within your facility, you're not having, that's really a major issue you got to get solved. A ventilation issue is you want to make sure you understand what your ventilation systems are and how they're working. There was an issue with a Whole Foods. They had a giant commissary that they had built, a huge warehouse, because they basically wanted to make all of their ready-to-eat foods that they sell in store in one location and then ship it out to all their stores to kind of save time and money. And they kept getting listeria outbreaks, and they couldn't figure out where it was coming from. And it was up, and it ended up that there was moisture pooling in the HVAC system in the vents. And so they ended up having to close the facility down because they didn't have the money or ability to actually change out the ventilation system because it was actually causing a full listeria spread contamination within their entire facility. Getting into what we were talking about, staying with our hands, but what you're looking for with cleaning and sanitizing. You want to make sure that you're removing all exposed food and you're actually having time to the cleaning process is going to be removing all debris. You're actually getting a proper rinse according to the actual chemicals being used within your facility, and then also having a proper sanitation. Upon that, with sanitation, and when you're doing your sanitizer, you need to have an air drying period. Because if you wash with a sanitizer and then you immediately start moving product across it, you have the potential for a chemical hazard from residue left from the sanitizer. So basically, and a lot of this goes with looking at the instructions on the chemicals you're using in your facility. They will have instructions saying for this caustic cleanser, it is a 30-second rinse, or sometimes it'll say it's a 60-second rinse. And then for their sanitizer, it'll say let dry for 1 minute or let dry for 5 minutes. And following the actual instructions and regulations of your chemical supplier is how you're going to be able to handle this correctly. So guys in the chat, why don't you give me some examples here of, we've kind of gone over a couple here of some different types of food contact surfaces that we might find in our production area. Yep. Do you guys use any like sort of mixing tools? Is there any, I don't really know how your process works. Is there any sort of like hand spatulas or anything like that that's used in your facility? Because those are also going to be considered food contact surfaces, utensils. Also, one we didn't talk about as much is your packaging materials are food contact surfaces. So you need to make sure that those are being stored in a safe and sanitary way and that you're actually receiving them from sanitary suppliers. So yeah, this is kind of all the stuff that we were going over there. So good job, everybody. Let's see here. Michelle, does this next part need your control or?
I can go through it real quick if you'd like.
I think maybe I'm looking. Sorry, I thought there was another slide coming up. My apologies.
No worries. Do you want me
No, I got it. No, I meant the exercise for the GMP scenario.
Oh, yeah. I think we'll go to lunch.
Should we go to lunch now, or do you want me to keep going?
Just go real fast through the next few slides, right?
Gotcha. Kind of what we were talking about here, we had our cleaning tools. These are things that only need to be used on the ground. We want to make sure that if tools are being used in the wrong area or if they're damaged, that supervisors are being made well aware of them. I've worked in places where they just didn't have squeegees that worked properly, and it took us 6 months to get an actual proper working squeegee. That's not the sort of things you want to have. You want to make sure that you're actually giving everybody the tool. You're asking everybody to perform all this extra attention for cleaning, set everybody up for success, and we'll give them the opportunity to do so. Cleaning and sanitizer storage, you need to make sure that you don't want to create a chemical hazard. You also don't want to mix the two. You want to make sure you have good, clean storage and good understanding of who is and is not supposed to be in contact with those chemicals and who is not supposed to be actually moving them, and that they're being stored in a clean and sanitary way, and they're not receiving them damaged. If there's any sort of like residue and caustic buildup, or you can smell fumes around your stored chemicals, you're going to have some issues with that. You need to make sure you get those cleaned. We'll kind of get past this with the general cleaning and sanitizing steps. This goes with, you're going to want to rinse, scrub down, get a proper rinse off of the chemical cleaning, perform your sanitizer step, and then have a proper drying step in place. Sanitation don'ts. You don't want to use high pressure hoses or clean drains. If you use a pressure washer on anything, you're just going to shoot everything on the ground up into the sky and basically aerolize any of the bacteria you're trying to get out of your facility. You don't want to use never use compressed air to clean equipment. Air compressors just pull from the actual air around you. That's not just oxygen. If you're actually using an air compressor on anything that's touching a food contact surface, it needs to come from an actual clean, sealed oxygen tank. You want to sanitize the food areas. If you are actually still producing your food, you want to make sure that you're not having any chemicals have any chance of actually getting into them. So you're going to want to wait until you're actually done with your full food production and then perform your cleaning steps. You don't want to do a wet midday clean. Wet cleaning means that you need to actually let it dry for a significant period of time. If that's the case and you're doing it in the midday and you run a whole wet clean on something and then you don't let it fully dry, you are introducing the possibility for biological and chemical hazards for the residue that would be left on that equipment if you kind of kept it going. And you don't want to let water spray on areas that are cleaned and sanitized surfaces. You've already sprayed sanitizer on it. You don't want to. You basically don't want to remove it and let it not do the work it's supposed to be doing. All right. Do we have any main questions? We've kind of talked about examples of non-food contact surfaces, but that's where we're getting into the walls, the ceiling, mops on the ground, garbage cans, but anything that is not actually in the food contact surface, but is still part of the environment. So it is in actually your facility. You want to make sure that everything is actually clean and sanitized and not actually capable of creating a biological hazard for your actual company. And again, we're talking about properly unclean shoes, cracks in the ground, improper drainage, making sure you have good clean ventilation systems. Is the walls and ceiling and storage racks of your coolers and storage areas clean?
I'm good with that.
Cool. I'm going to switch control over to you.
All right. So we brought up HACCP a few times before. That's the Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point System. And as the name implies, it is focused on looking at your product, your ingredients, your process, and figuring out what hazards exist within it, and then looking at different points in that process and figuring out where we can control those hazards. Critical control points are going to be defined here, but they will be a specific point in your process that is crucial to control a hazard and make sure that nothing injurious to public health enters commerce. It is not a zero risk system. So what that means is that a HACCP plan is going to focus on the hazards that are most significant. And by that, we mean those that are most severe in the health risk that they pose and those that are most likely to occur in your process or that are most strongly tied to the specific product that you're making. So where did it come from? It was introduced in 1959. NASA was working with the Pillsbury Company. They wanted to produce safe food for astronauts in space. If you can imagine the worst place in the galaxy to get food poisoning, it's probably in a space capsule. No one wants to have vomiting, diarrhea, nausea, anything like that in a cramped space capsule or perhaps in a spacesuit. That would be really dangerous and uncomfortable. So they needed to figure out a way to ensure that they could handle all of the different potential causes of that illness before they sent that food into the space capsule. In 1971, Pillsbury ended up implementing it in their own food processing facility, recognizing that it was a huge improvement over the way that they were operating previously. In 1998, it was made mandatory in meat and poultry facilities, and so the HACCP plan now becomes part of government regulation, something that's being inspected. The HACCP program is split into 7 principles. There are some preliminary steps that are done before you do these, like creating a team and figuring out what kind of product you have. But when you actually implement HACCP, you begin with doing a hazard analysis. And there are a lot of tools that you can use to aid in this. The USDA and the FDA have published a lot of guidance and made recommendations specific to whatever kind of product you're making, to the point that you can look up if it's an FDA regulated product. You can look at their draft guidance and see for even a very specific ingredient or product what hazards they've commonly encountered with it. And they have a table that breaks that down by biological hazards, chemical hazards, and then process and physical hazards. And you can see a little chart where it might say Salmonella, E. coli, Clostridium botulinum, and they will give you recommendations. But ultimately, this is something that you have to perform specific to your company because you are the expert in your own product. Your product and your process especially if it's something novel that other people haven't done before, may have unique hazards. Once you've figured out what those hazards are and which ones are significant enough that they require a control point, you have to figure out where in your process that control point can be. If we were looking at these examples here, maybe we know that the product has a high likelihood of metal, either because it's an agricultural product and the harvesting combines are known to dump metal into the crop when it's being harvested, or that maybe we have a piece of machinery that often creates fragments of metal. So we put a critical control point in to control that hazard, in this case, a metal detector. It's a specific step in the process responsible for controlling the hazard. And then you establish a critical limit. Anytime you have a critical control point, you have to have some sort of parameter that determines what is and isn't safe. So in this case, they've said no detectable metal fragments in the finished product. They're probably going to make sure that the metal detector that they've chosen is calibrated such that it can actually detect fragments that would be hazardous to a person. Then they have monitoring procedures. And this is important because when you determine your critical limits, or your critical control points and your critical limits, you have to be able to realistically monitor them all the time when your process is running. So you're making a commitment in your plan to do this. And there are 4 questions regarding monitoring processes, which are: what is it that you're monitoring? How are you monitoring it? Who's responsible? And how frequently do you check it? And then you have corrective actions, which are also necessary when you have a critical control point. And these are saying, if we violate the critical limit, if the control point fails in some way, what do we have to do to make sure that no product that's dangerous makes it out into the public? So oftentimes that will include stopping a production line, figuring out how much product was affected, holding it, segregating it from the rest of your product, evaluating the disposition. Is it something that can be reworked? Is it something that has to be destroyed? And then looking for the root cause of the problem, figuring out if it was a mechanical failure, if it was a lack of training, something that you need to address on the personnel side, or if it was something new and unique to the product. Regardless, one of the aspects of this corrective action is that we want to make sure that whatever problem we encounter doesn't reoccur. If you have the same problem over and over and aren't taking steps to prevent reoccurrence, that is something that you will get dinged on when someone's doing a HACCP inspection. They want to see that we're using this as a tool for continuous improvement. And verification means that we are making sure that the HACCP plan is being properly implemented and is functioning in the way that we want it to. In the case of this metal detector, every time someone monitors the metal detector, they're writing a log. And as we said before, if something isn't documented, it didn't happen. So we need to have documentation that this critical control point is being monitored at the frequency that we've committed to. And that whatever observations or measurements that we made do not exceed our critical limits. And someone's going to go back and do a records review on those verification, or verify the records that we're taking during monitoring, rather. And as Michelle said earlier, if this is an FDA regulated facility, they've got about 7 business days to do that. If it's a USDA FSIS inspected facility, they need to accomplish that before the product is sent out. And so your record keeping is the 7th principle, and that's going to include that metal detector operation log that we talked about. But it might have like an annual calibration log, any accuracy checks, training documents to show that the employees responsible for monitoring that control point know how to do so properly. And we're going to have to hold on to those records so that we have proof that this entire plan is being implemented in a way that controls the hazard. So, in particular, for a facility that is being inspected by the FSIS, We need to make sure that we have a flow chart describing the steps of every process, and the product flow and the establishment shall be prepared. This is something that they're going to look at probably before you begin any operation. They will actually validate for USDA facilities that whatever controls you're putting in place are actually adequate to control the hazard before production actually begins. The intended use or consumers of the finished product are going to be identified. This is especially important for meat and poultry because the intended use can mean is a product going out frozen and raw? Has it been cooked in the facility and is just getting reheated? How much of the associated hazard is the end user going to be responsible for controlling? That's something that has to be really well defined. And any appropriate labeling instructions to tell people what kind of cooking they need to do or what kind of hazards still exist in the product when they receive it is extremely important. Then regarding that flow chart, we're going to need to make sure that any critical control points on that chart are clearly identified, and we'll use some sort of consistent naming system to identify them. So with the product description, this is an example of a potato chip company and what that might look like in the HACCP plan. So you see page 3 out of 23. This is part of their entire HACCP plan. This is just one page that we're looking at. They've included what the product is that is being covered. And in fact, they have grouped several similar products together here because they have similar qualities. That is acceptable. It is up to the judgment of the company what products make sense to group together. Oftentimes, they will make that decision based on things like water activity, pH, similar traits, and then what allergens are contained in the product may also be part of that decision. So they've told us that they have all these different types of potato chips, and it's a deep fried flavored potato product. They've mentioned that 2 of the potato chips have allergens in them. What ingredients all of the chips contain, and then what ingredients are specific to the individual flavors, what kind of packaging they're going in. Their intended use is ready to eat. So this facility is probably going to be very concerned with environmental pathogens. They know that the consumer is not going to cook those potato chips in the oven for 10 minutes. That's very unlikely to happen. So any bacteria, any viral contamination, anything like that that makes it out of the facility on that product is highly likely to make someone sick. So they have a very big responsibility for sanitation here. The intended consumer is the general public. We know that children eat potato chips. It's a common snack food. Elderly people might eat potato chips, especially if they go out to a diner and it's served with a sandwich. You have to assume that vulnerable segments of the population are probably going to consume this product and take care of our hazards accordingly. It has a shelf life of 2 months. And then in our labeling instructions, we know that we have to label any allergens that exist within the 9 allergens that are required to be declared in the United States. And the distribution is that they're going to be boxed and palleted, shipped out on trucks. So this document has an issue date. It has a date that it was approved. You can find the date of the document that it supersedes. So we have continuity in our record keeping. They could go back and see what changed at that point if we wanted to. This is a very thorough product description. Here's an example of their flow diagram. So you'll see that up at the top, we have these receiving steps, receiving packaging, receiving ingredients, and you can follow these sections of the flow chart to see where they enter the actual process. So those ingredients go in pretty much right at the start, but the packaging doesn't enter the process until the fill and packaging stage. Each of these steps is going to have to be looked at during the hazard analysis to find out if there are any hazards that are introduced, enhanced, or controlled at those steps. And we have to figure out what the critical control points are. So can anyone hazard a guess what might be critical control points on this flow diagram for this potato chip factory? And you're welcome to write those in the chat if you'd like. X-ray is absolutely a critical control point. And there's one more as well. So if we think about what kind of hazards exactly, that frying step is probably going to be required to kill any pathogenic bacteria that might be on those potatoes when they enter the process. So those would both be labeled, and the labeling could be CCP FRY and CCP X-ray or something like that. That would be enough. But we would want to show on our flow diagram that we knew these were critical control points. So who came up with the idea of HACCP? Yeah, so NASA working with Pillsbury, they originally created that idea. And a lot of the other things that they worked on made it into our consumer food market, like Space Food Sticks or Tang, if you've ever had the flavored drink. That was also a result of this project. So I mentioned hazards before. The definition of a hazard is a biological, chemical, or physical agent that is reasonably likely to cause illness or injury in the absence of its control. And so that, again, is alluding to the need for a critical control point. Oftentimes in your hazard analysis, you will have rows that have a B, a C, and a P so that you can identify hazards in each of those categories. And there are some ingredients that may have all three. Some may only have one. One thing to note here is that allergens are considered a chemical hazard, just like pesticides or naturally occurring toxins. When we evaluate hazards, we are trying to figure out if they're significant. So a significant hazard is one that has a severe health risk and one that is reasonably likely to occur. And in that HACCP plan, we will have a section for justification where we explain if we think that a hazard is or isn't severe or isn't reasonably likely to occur and why that is. And that is showing those who inspect us that we have done our research, that we're an expert in our product, that we know the severity of the hazards that we're trying to control. If you make a claim that something is not reasonably likely to occur, one way that you might say that in a HACCP plan is that it is not reasonably likely to need a control because it is handled by a prerequisite program or a CGMP. So, for example, if you were worried about, say, loose hair getting into the product, you might say, what's the severity of that health hazard? Well, it's disgusting, but it's not really likely to make someone have a lifelong health consequence or a severe illness. Is it reasonably likely to occur? You might say no, it's not reasonably likely to occur because we have a good manufacturing practice of requiring hair nets and beard nets. So both no's, you could end up with something that didn't require control points. On the other hand, if your hazard was something like salmonella, you might say, is it severe? Yes, it can have serious health implications. People with compromised immune systems can die as a result. People can have lifelong chronic health problems. Is it reasonably likely to occur? Yes, it is associated with the particular product. Maybe I'm making a chicken breast, and I know that it is an associated hazard. And I can't really control it with a prerequisite program. No amount of washing hands or keeping the facility clean is going to prevent salmonella from being in that chicken. So we have to do some sort of control to make sure the product is safe. Like I mentioned before, there are three main categories. Physical hazards can be glass, metal, wood, stones. I've heard of a facility that had golf balls as a physical hazard. It wasn't anything that the FDA would have warned you about, but if your farm is next to a golf course, maybe you have it. Anything that is in the product when it is harvested, anything that might be introduced to it as a result of machines. Mixers are particularly bad for getting metal shavings into a product. Chemicals, we mentioned allergens. These are a deadly hazard. They are a very high severity hazard. People may have a deadly allergic reaction in the form of anaphylactic shock. And even if they have an EpiPen, it might not be able to prevent them from dying from exposure to allergens. It's also very insidious because oftentimes people will have a mild reaction once and then a deadly reaction the second time or at a later date. And we really don't have a lot of way to predict when this is going to happen. So we have to take extra care to control that hazard. And in a HACCP plan, this would be in the form of labeling SOPs and making sure that all allergens that have a legal requirement to be declared show up on that package, making sure the correct labels go onto a filling line or a production line. When we get to preventative controls, you'll see that they elevate that because the reality is that 54% of recalls are coming from undeclared allergens these days, and it is a very severe risk. Other things you might have are toxins. If you were handling puffer fish, we know that that has a pretty serious toxin in it, but even things like apples can have naturally forming toxins. Different foods that have mold on them can sometimes develop toxins too. These chemicals can also be something in our process: grease, sanitizer, pollutants. Dosage is very important in the case of sanitizers to make sure that we don't overdose a chemical and leave a residue that could become a chemical hazard. It's not always true that more is better, and we need to have, especially for a USDA facility, SSOPs for sanitization to make sure that we have very clear processes on how we clean things. And then the most popular biological hazards include bacteria, viruses, parasites, and molds. Bacteria has been a big one. We've heard a lot about Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria, Clostridium botulinum if you're dealing with something that has low oxygen or no oxygen. But viruses can also be a problem. There is some hepatitis that can actually be transferred through food, and sometimes people will get vaccinated to protect against that. You can have norovirus. There was an incident in Raleigh where about 300 people got ill because a sushi chef was preparing a raw product and came into work sick. That could have been handled by CGMPs and having a good sickness policy. Parasites. These are very common in seafood, but you can also have them in other foods. You can have trichinella in pork. We can have things like Giardia, Cryptosporidium, Cyclospora that can all be transmitted to food through the water, or we might have molds as well. Like I said, some of those can have toxins. Sometimes molds and yeast can just be a spoilage organism and a quality issue, but other times they can produce an actual hazard that can make someone sick. Physical hazards, we've got dirt, dust, metal, glass. You might have a policy in your facility to make sure that all of your lights are protected so that a forklift, for example, couldn't drive by and shatter a light bulb and spill glass into your product. You might have to be concerned about certain machines that are more likely than others to put off metal fragments. A prerequisite program of preventative maintenance could help guard against that. But if it's something that has a high likelihood, you might need a metal detector. CGMPs We're going to try to prevent some of these physical hazards by telling people what they can and can't wear. No fake eyelashes, no fake nails, no loose jewelry, etc. But in the case of something like golf balls, you might have a very unique physical hazard. The reason that these are dangerous oftentimes is that they can either cause choking or laceration of the esophagus. And for a physical hazard to be considered safe, sometimes, and this is not something that I love to think about as a consumer, but sometimes any fragment of metal under a certain size is less likely to cause serious harm. And so the reality is that metal detectors can detect sometimes down to 1.5 millimeters, depending on whether it's a ferrous or non-ferrous metal. Anything smaller than that might be able to get through. But the reality is that if I were to consume it, I'd probably swallow it. It would pass just fine. So we want to try and keep everything out of the product, but we're especially focused on debris that could cause injury. So we've got not a specific size guidance, although the FDA Sharps guidance can be used as a good source, where they say something between 7 and 25 millimeters is especially likely to cause damage when it is swallowed. Another thing that exists is there are actually devices that can be used for measuring pieces of toys and things for children, where they have a little plastic device that looks like the diameter of a windpipe, and you can put a piece in there and see is it likely to cause choking. The reality is you probably have a metal detector setting, if you're using an industrial metal detector, that can detect something down to a few millimeters. And we're going to have test wands available oftentimes to calibrate that to make sure that it's detecting at the size we want. Chemical hazards, they can be naturally occurring or they can be added chemicals. Sometimes these are things that are acceptable in a small amount, but may have an action level if they exceed that. So in apples, there's a chemical called patulin, and if it exists past, I think it's 50 parts per billion, then that is the action level when it would become a hazard. So we have to find some way to control it. A lot of manufacturing facilities are going to get guarantees from their supplier or certificates of analysis to control some of these. When it comes to chemical hazards, pesticides are a really big one. If we're getting something imported from another country that doesn't have as high compliance to pesticide regulations as there is in the US, we have to be mindful that any food that we bring in from them has to be compliant with the United States pesticide regulation. And so that's something that we might even do an audit of a facility to make sure that they're being compliant. And we might even challenge a guarantee that they give us by sending it to a lab and making sure that it really is compliant. I mentioned before that there were 9 top food allergens that are required to be declared on labels in the United States. Does anyone know what is the most recent addition to this list? If you want to hazard a guess. Yeah, that's correct. So previously it was 8, but sesame has been added on here, and I did see a recent recall where someone was having to pull a product back because it had an undeclared sesame allergen. If we have a tree nut allergen, we're going to declare, what kind of tree nuts are in there. And these regulations vary from company to company, from country to country. Different countries have different required allergen declarations. For example, in Canada, mustard is on their list of required declarations. So if we send something outside the United States, we will have to be compliant with those as well. You can see 1 to 2% of adults have a food allergy, 5 to 6% of children. We have to treat these as though it is a deadly health hazard because we can't control who is going to consume the product. If they have only a mild allergy or a deadly allergy, we need to give them all the information that they can to choose a food that is safe to consume. anyone know what's wrong with this picture? You might have to squint at it for a second. Does anybody in here eat a lot of shrimp? Because usually when I get tartar sauce, it's a different color. And when I get cocktail sauce, it looks about like that. So this was an example of a facility that was making tartar sauce and making cocktail sauce. And their cocktail sauce got put into the wrong package. That made it through their facility, through their packaging. It got shipped out to the store, made it all the way to the store shelf, and no one caught it. That could be an allergen risk if you have a package for one product and a product that is completely different inside it. You might have undeclared allergens that could cause someone a severe allergic reaction. So we have to take packaging and labeling especially serious and make sure that we have everything correct. These can be monitored where you check at the beginning, the middle, the end of the run to make sure you've got the right labels or the right package, or anytime you make a change to your formula to make sure that it's captured in that labeling. So I mentioned some of these earlier. Biological hazards, you've got pathogenic bacteria, you've got different types of fungi and parasites. Bacteria usually need to be killed with heat. If you cool something down that has bacteria on it, it will slow their growth rate. They may become dormant, but they're not really gone. This is why if you have the potato salad at the family picnic and then you put it away in the refrigerator for 2 hours and then you bring it back out and let it go for another 3 hours, suddenly these bacteria, even if they stopped growing while they were in the refrigerator, as soon as you warm up again, they're going to start growing even more. The amount of bacteria is cumulative. So none of them went away when they were put into a lower temperature. They just took a break. So if there were 4,000 bacteria, it's a very low number. It's millions, really. But if, let's say they grew to 4,000 and then you refrigerate them, you're going to have all 4,000 of them again when you take it out of the refrigerator, ready to go. Viruses are a little different in that while they can survive on a surface in what would be kind of harsh conditions, they need to be inside a host to grow. So viruses will wait until they come into contact with the human body. Maybe you go out to eat, you touch the table, you touch the handrail. Someone who has a virus has been sneezing on their hands and they've left viral particles there. You touch the handrail, you can't see that there's anything on it. And then you go to rub your eyes or your mouth or your nose. Now those viral particles have a way into the body, they have a host, and then they can reproduce and make you sick. Parasites, there are some that are very vulnerable to freezing and thawing. If done as a cycle, this can kill parasites. Sometimes they are a more complex organism, so they're a little more susceptible to that than, say, bacteria would be. Another really important one to know, just because it's been in the news so much with Boar's Head and a lot of other companies, you're probably familiar with the guidance that people learn in ServSafe, the danger zone for food being between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 4 hours. One thing that doesn't capture is that Listeria monocytogenes, which is a very deadly pathogenic bacteria, can continue growing even at 31.8 degrees, which is below 32 degrees. So even in the freezer, if a food is contaminated with Listeria, it can still be growing slowly during that entire time, and even more once it warms up. So the conditions that cause bacteria to multiply, there's an acronym here called FAT-TOM. So the first thing that they need is going to be some source of food. And then the A is for acidity. Bacteria often have a difficult time growing at low pH. So if something is very acidic, like 4.6 pH or lower, 4.9 or lower, it depends on the specific bacteria, but that can control them. That's why we have acidified foods. Things like pickling can prevent bacterial growth because you create an environment that is inhospitable. They need time to grow. If you have a small amount of contamination and you give it hours and hours of time, it will turn into a contamination that can make someone sick. They need an appropriate temperature to grow. For most foodborne pathogens, that's somewhere in that danger zone, that 40 to 140. But they have an ideal growth temperature too, and it might be around room temperature, or it might be 80 to 90 degrees. That information can be found in FDA guidance. You can look up specific foodborne pathogens and find out what their growth curve looks like, what kind of conditions they can tolerate. The presence or absence of oxygen. So a lot of the things that we're concerned with grow in oxygenated environments. They would be considered aerobic bacteria, but you also have anaerobic bacteria that grow in an environment without oxygen, or facultative, where they can handle either environment. So, for example, Clostridium botulinum would be a bacteria that you'd have to worry about in low or reduced oxygen environment. So knowing what conditions can support the organisms that you're worried about. And then moisture is going to be the last. We talked about how listeria grows in facilities when there's a lot of condensation, water puddling or leaking. This is going to be a huge risk factor. A lot of facilities will be taking a lot of care to keep them very dry to prevent bacterial growth. This is also why the water activity of a product, what percentage of it is water, is a huge factor in what kind of risk you have for bacterial growth. So we've got known and foreseeable hazards in the 3 different categories. They can also be introduced naturally, like those toxins that are natural to a pufferfish or an apple. They can be introduced unintentionally. Maybe someone purchased a non-food grade chemical on our production line instead of the appropriate food grade chemical, and it came into contact with something that had arsenic or another harmful chemical in it. And the last way that a hazard can be introduced is intentionally, either as the result of a disgruntled employee or for economic gain. There have been some big cases where people were introducing chemicals for economic gain. It's called economically motivated adulteration. There was an example where melamine was put into baby milk to make it look like it had a higher protein content. It fooled the test that was being used to measure that, and it turned out to be very toxic to infants. The same thing happened again with dog food. In North Carolina, there was also a recent incident where applesauce was giving children lead poisoning, and they found out that the cinnamon had a high lead content, and there's some suspicion that that may have been done intentionally because lead is very heavy. Adding it into an agricultural product might make it seem like it had more of the actual product, and if you're being paid by weight, you could use that to make more money without having more cinnamon. But the health consequence was really severe and tragic. For this reason, we have to be careful about our suppliers and make sure that we trust the people that are sending us things, and that we also do our own second-party lab analysis or third-party lab analysis to make sure that they're not lying about hazards that might be in their product. So, what are the 3 types of food safety hazards? We got the 3 categories. You have biologicals, the first one. Chemical.
Good. good. I see physical, chemical, bio. Somebody.
Yeah. All right.
Guys.
When we get into preventative controls for human food, they actually even include radiological as part of chemical hazards. So that can be a thing too, depending on which of these plants you're using. And what is a significant hazard? There are really two halves of that answer. What things make something a significant hazard? Exactly. So they use the term reasonably likely to occur, and they look at the severity. So is it likely, and is it going to do severe harm? Exactly. So here it is again. A significant hazard is one that is reasonably likely to occur and presents a health risk if it is not controlled. We talked about hazard analysis. So you go through that flow diagram, every single step, all the way from receiving to when it leaves the facility. And for each step, we're going to look at hazards, figure out if there's anything new that's been introduced, if there's anything that is enhanced, or if it's a step that a hazard is being controlled. For each hazard, we'll look at the severity, and we're going to justify the decision. Like I said before, this is kind of where we're proving that we understand the severity of our hazards. We're going to make a justification whether or not they're likely to occur. We might reference our prerequisite programs or our CGMPs, or we might make the decision that we need a control measure because we don't have a prerequisite program that can handle it. Once we come up with a control measure, we'll identify what that is and explain whether or not it's being controlled at that step. If I receive a raw chicken breast into my factory, I've identified that there is a hazard of salmonella, but it might not be controlled until later when I cook it. So it is okay to say, no, the control measure is not happening at this step, but it is going to happen later. And then when that step comes up, we'll bring it up again and show that it's being controlled. Here's an example of the hazard analysis for that company. So we've got two steps that they have on the sheet here. They've got the filling and packaging step and their X-ray step. And like I said before, in each of these, we've got three rows, one for each category of hazard. So they said they were worried about allergens at the packaging step and plastic at the packaging step. And because this is packaging, they need to make sure they have those correct labels on there. So they said, does it require a critical control point? Yes. They said the severity that they justified it here is that allergic reactions can be fatal. They also have a requirement that allergens must be on the label. And so they've implemented a critical control point here to do a label check. And they're saying, yes, that label check occurs at this step, the fill and packaging step. Meanwhile, they had a plastic hazard. They said, yeah, it requires a critical control point. It can cause choking, but they're not checking for it when they package. They're actually going to wait until it hits that X-ray to check for it. So it is introduced here. It does require a control point, but no, it's not happening at the fill and packaging step. Now, if we go on to the X-ray step, now they've brought that hazard in again, and they said, yeah, it requires a control point because it can cause choking. And the critical control point is the X-ray, and now we are at the step. So you don't have to necessarily list a hazard at every single step once it's been introduced, but you do have to list it when it shows up and when it is controlled. Also, one thing to note, this allergen labeling critical control point is voluntary. Sometimes you can use CGMP and prerequisite programs to show that you have an SOP for doing a label check. But the reality is that allergens are the source of so many recalls and such a high severity food hazard that even in this HACCP plan, they've decided to make it a critical control point. If you were in a preventative controls program, you'd have a whole category of controls based on allergens. So it might be that they are aware of that severity and chose to take the extra step in a HACCP plan. Critical control points are based on the result of your hazard analysis. So we figure out what the hazards are and how we can control them. And we can do that sometimes through things like metal detecting, x-rays, acidification, thermal processing, whether that's cooking a food or freezing and thawing it if it were a fish and we were worried about a parasite. So a lot of different control points occur in a process, but the ones that are essential to make the food safe are the critical control points. And those are the ones that if we lose control of that control point or we violate our critical limits, we now have to assume that the food is suspect. It is no longer guaranteed safe, and we have to pull that product somehow and figure out how to make it safe. And again, the critical limits, these are parameters that set the boundaries of what is acceptable. And in fact, you see this is the definition from the European Codex Alimentarius. They say it's a criterion which separates acceptability from unacceptability. This definition here is from the National Advisory Committee on Microbiological Criteria for Food. They say a critical limit is the maximum or minimum level a biological, chemical, or physical hazard has to be controlled at a critical control point to either prevent, eliminate, or reduce it to an acceptable level. One thing to note, you have to be able to achieve your critical limits. If you say that your critical limit is 0 of something, none of it whatsoever, you've got to be able to prove that you can accomplish that. A lot of critical limits are more about this reducing to an acceptable level. So the USDA might have a meat and poultry guidance that says salmonella in a chicken breast has to have a 7 log reduction in salmonella. And they will even recommend time and temperature that has to be done to accomplish that. So they're not saying that we have 0 cells of salmonella, because maybe that's not something that they can realistically accomplish, but they do reduce it to a level that it will be safe in food. We've got holidays coming up, cooking the turkey to an appropriate temperature. You can think of that like a critical limit. You've got a time and temperature that you have to keep it at for it to be safe. If the temperature is lower, then it might need a longer time. And we're going to monitor that critical limit by looking at an oven thermometer and a timer to make sure that we've hit it. And then we can probably use a meat thermometer at the end to make sure that that was true. For the chip company, here's an example of their logs. So when we looked at the 7 principles of HACCP, you remember that one of them was monitoring. Every critical control point is going to have documentation that it's being monitored. And this is how they've chosen to do it. They have put a title on the form. They've told us the location that we're looking at. We've got the critical limit that is super important. They needed 170 degrees for 2.5 minutes. And then every time someone is monitoring that, they'll date it. They'll put the time, what lot code for traceability. And then they'll put the actual temperature that was observed or measured, the actual cook time. And this is important here. They'll need to show whether or not it met the critical limit and initial it. Someone's going to go back later and review this log and write what date they reviewed it. So what is a critical limit? And you don't need to write the word for word full definition, but you can give a general idea of what it is. Yeah, that's a pretty good definition. We've set some kind of parameter, and if we exceed that parameter, we can't consider the food to be safe anymore unless we do something to rework it. And if we can't, then we may just have to destroy it. Here are the full definitions for you again. One thing to note, every critical control point has to have at least one critical limit. Sometimes we'll have more. It might be a required time and temperature. It might be a belt speed and an oven setting if we know that this will create a combination that will make the food safe. It has to be well defined because we need to know when we've crossed it. Validation. This is the act of proving that our control points have a scientific basis, that they are scientifically valid, that they will actually function the way that we want them to. If we were cooking a potato chip, we probably want to figure out that the temperature that those potato chips are reaching will really kill the bacteria that we're concerned about. In the Jack in the Box example that was brought up earlier, they made a decision about how to cook their burgers that was based on a subjective measure. It was quality based. But what they didn't do is create a scientific basis for that cook temperature to make sure it would be safe. And in fact, it wasn't. They chose a temperature that wasn't high enough to control the hazard of E. coli because they didn't validate it. So validation, you can look at scientific publications, regulatory documents. You can go to trade associations. You can go to maybe universities that have done studies. You can even do your own studies within a facility. You can do a study specific to your equipment and your product as long as you have a scientifically significant sample size and good experimental process. You can use some of that to justify what you're doing. So again, we're making sure that the HACCP plan will really control the hazards, that our parameters can actually be achieved in our process. We're also going to make sure that when we write the plan, that it occurs the way that we've written it down. And if we have any deficiencies, if we start getting a bunch of customer complaints, or if we have repeated failures, we might need to review and reevaluate whether or not that plan is appropriate. If we get new equipment or if we change our formula. And then you will also end up just reanalyzing that plan on a regular basis, maybe annually in the case of a USDA facility, to make sure that it's still accurate. The Food Safety Inspection Service, they are going to also do some verification activities. They're going to review the HACCP plan. They're going to want to see all your records of critical control points and make sure that your corrective actions, are adequate to prevent the hazard from making someone sick. They're going to make sure your critical limits are in line with what their guidance is. They might also look at other records pertaining to the HACCP plan. This could be the training records. This could be calibration records or things like that. Corrective action records. They may do a observation of monitoring to make sure that people that are monitoring a critical control point are doing it correctly. Sample collection. This is a way of verifying that once the critical control point has been put in place, that the food coming out on the other end is actually free of a hazard. And they may also conduct a record review. So you're going to need to have those records on site and available so that you can prove that your plan is being implemented. As far as how long those records need to be retained, the FSIS requires them 1 year for raw or fresh products. 2 years of those products are frozen, preserved, or shelf stable. FDA requires 2 years on all products. But the reality is, if you have a product with an especially long shelf life, you may want to hold on to this longer because that's sort of extending that window of how long your product might be out there in the wild before someone's exposed to a hazard in it. Best practice is to keep those longer. Regulatory record review, we've brought this up a few times. In an FDA facility, all of those records have to be reviewed within 7 business days, whereas an FSIS facility requires it prior to the product being shipped. Here's another list of those 7 principles that we talked about, and you can see where they've been put in place on this chips potatoes record. They've figured out their hazard. They've got a control point. They have critical limits. They monitor it. You've got what's the corrective action when something does go wrong. And you can see that they are checking those records every 7 days. And they've got a list of what sort of records this critical control point generates. Does anyone have any questions about HACCP? If you were to take a full HACCP class, you will learn much more about it, but that's a very brief overview of what a HACCP plan is all about. All right, I'm going to move on, but if you do have a question, feel free to pop it in the chat, and one of us will be happy to talk about it. Here's the question: what do viruses need to grow? A little bit of TLC.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah, so they may exist on the surface, but they will not actually start growing until they're in a viable host. Humans and animals can sometimes be part of the same virus's life cycle, and yeah, even sometimes for years, viruses can survive on the surface. All right. So for this one, we are going to identify whether the hazard is a biological, chemical, or physical hazard. So I'm going to start with metal. And physical.
Yes, they do. Somebody did it. Good job.
Cool. These are chemicals, it looks like. We got pesticides. So where would our pesticides be found? I think I actually said the word. Yep.
Somebody wrote it. There we go.
All right. E. coli. Biological, definitely. This is norovirus.
Mm-hmm. Somebody's going for the bio.
Now, the last one is tricky because it could be maybe a couple different things. So what do we think? This is a peanut. So the peanut is tricky because we could have a biological hazard. There could be salmonella on the peanuts. It could be a chemical hazard because of the allergen. And depending on our process, it could even be a physical hazard if those peanut shells are creating a choking hazard. So yeah, you could potentially find a way to justify any of those for the peanut.
All three.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Michelle.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. So now that Jeff explained all about HACCP to us, the next step is to go into preventive controls for human foods. So this can give you an idea of essentially what the elevated regulation is all about and the things that you'll have to follow according to the FDA. And I feel like we've given you good examples of all these things. I do like that this plate is pretty cool. You get to see what was living on somebody's hand. It's pretty amazing. Okay. So for the Food Safety Modernization Act, this law was passed by Obama in 2011. It's the biggest change to a regulation that we had seen in the past 70 years since the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It's pretty significant there. And the whole goal is to make sure that we're preventing food safety issues, just like we started talking about this morning. Yeah, Steven says red tartar sauce. Exactly. So that's that, tighter allergen control that we need. Right. So we don't have as many nightmares. So, it is so easy to accidentally put the wrong product or the product in the wrong container or put the wrong label on it. It's rough and can definitely give you nightmares. All right. So why do we need the Food Safety Modernization Act? clearly our food systems and our types of foods, our food products, they're changing and evolving all the time. And we have new innovations all the time. Actually, I've been really curious. So I'm going to ask you, can you describe your process to me? Would somebody unmute and like explain a little what you can? I don't know if you have any constraints around what you're able to say, but can you just tell me a little bit about your process? Hey, Anthony, would you mute yourself? You're like, thanks. Anybody willing to unmute and tell me? You make magic meat. Yes.
I can give just a brief overview. So we are a hybrid product between cell cultured chicken and soy protein. And so we produce the cell cultures and combine those into a soy protein product. So that's just a very, very brief overview.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And then the cell cultured product, right? It's going into a bioreactor, and I'm assuming that's getting like blended somehow with the soy protein. And then I've seen videos where they do like 3D printing of that. Is that what you do, or do you just like culture it, blend it, package it, and call it a day?
We produce the media, and then that media is combined with soy protein. So it's not a scaffolding network.
I see. Okay, cool. Gotcha. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it was cool to look into research on this and see what's out there. So clearly,
This was a really cool thing. I do also want to say thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, so clearly you guys have a pretty high-tech product. You think about other things that we've created over the years, things like CRISPR, right, where we're editing genes of products, so genetically modified organisms and genetically engineered organisms, and we get fun things like watermelon without seeds, right, or any number of other exciting foods out there. It does make it a little bit more challenging, though, right? When you're trying to develop these new processes to see like what is the best process, what is the safest process, how are we going to manage this with our regulators? And we know more than our regulators about this. So what does that mean, right? For a lot of places, a lot of companies that struggle with that, they might be reaching out to, other manufacturers or people in other countries, or looking at regulations in other countries to see how they can bridge that gap. So the Food Safety Modernization Act basically was developed in an attempt to address this issue, right? Because we can't be operating on laws that are over 70 years old at this point. The other thing is that we have a growing population of at-risk individuals, right? So like our elderly population is quite large. And so we need to be more careful about what we're doing when we have this mass production. I mentioned this earlier about the globalization of our food supply and about our imports, how much product gets, shipped overseas, and the FDA's limited ability to manage that. Right now, they're only able to inspect a little bit less than 1 pound in 1 million pounds of imported foods. It's not a great catch-all system. And that's why they've increased these regulations around supply chain, and so they have a foreign supply chain verification program. So we're trying to find ways to go to third-party auditors or second-party audits. We're basically going to check up on the people that we're buying from. So if I'm buying cumin from China, maybe I require that they have an SQF certificate, a safe quality food certificate, or something else, so that I can trust that they're making their products safely and they're not doing something like what happened to this taco kit company, where the taco kit, the cumin manufacturer was putting peanut shells into that cumin and sending that to the taco kit manufacturer. They ended up with an undeclared allergen. This is pretty bad. So this regulation really helps us get a hold on where we're responsible as companies and what the expectations are. All right, so the Food Safety Modernization Act not only made preventive controls for human foods, which is what we're talking about right now, they also created preventive controls for animal foods, essentially making food for animals just as safe as human food. Produce safety, so specific rules, right, for growing in the fields. And thinking about, how accessible is hand washing for a group of individuals who are out there hand picking your strawberries or your blueberries, right? Things around like not harvesting from the ground, thinking about pesticide use, what pesticides we're using, how much and when. Then that foreign supplier verification program, third-party auditors for certification bodies. That's what I was talking about earlier with safe quality foods. There are lots of different programs out there that you can utilize that help you strengthen those supply chain controls, because you're essentially requiring them to have a certificate that includes both food safety and quality. And they're going to be held more accountable because they'll be audited more regularly. Then we have sanitary transportation. We think about, it's pretty easy to accidentally have some kind of cross-contamination during shipping. And so those trucks, the shipping containers, whatever is being shipped on, really matters. How clean they are and what that product's going out with or coming in with. And then intentional adulteration is about food defense. So if somebody intentionally harms a food product, right, how can we prevent against the risk of that? Because it has happened, just like with that cumin and the peanut shells in the cumin example. So how do we prevent things like that? So lots of different stuff going into this regulation. But we're focusing on the preventive controls for human foods part. And what it did is it takes prerequisite programs, it takes HACCP, and it blends it all together, and it elevates certain requirements. So it elevates those sanitation requirements and allergen requirements and supply chain requirements. So you'll notice there's a lot of overlap in the language that we use, and then the steps we're going to go over. You'll notice they look almost exactly the same as what Jeff went over, with some key differences, which we'll look at. In addition to including allergen sanitation and supply chain controls, they also require a recall plan within your food safety plan, right? So that in the HACCP plan, a recall plan wasn't required, but it is under preventive controls for human foods. So can you tell me, are CGMP similar to prerequisite programs? So green check for yes, red X for no. What do you think? When Anthony was talking about prerequisite programs, he was talking specifically about sanitation standard operating procedures. Other prerequisite programs out there might be like glass prevention programs, something of that nature. So what do you think? Is that similar to what you learned about current good manufacturing practices? Yeah. Excellent. So comparing your HACCP plan and a food safety plan, it starts with that hazard analysis. And in the HACCP plan, we were looking at biological, chemical, and physical hazards. In your food safety plan, in the preventive controls regulation, we also include radiological hazards, and that is because of accidents like what happened at Chernobyl and Fukushima, where essentially you have an accident that affects the surrounding areas, so the water and the soil and the plants and the animals and everything, the people. The radiological hazard can persist for a really long time. And so there have been incidences where there are companies that have actually used items from there to sell. So for example, there was a company that harvested trees from the Chernobyl area, excuse me, to make paper boxes, and they use those paper boxes for food. those boxes were still emitting radiation. It's a big no-no. There's also another company there. They make vodka, and they're using potatoes from Chernobyl. They say it's safe. I don't know. And the other addition is those economically motivated hazards. So, like the company with the cumin and the peanuts, they're trying to save themselves money by thinning out that cumin using peanut shells and hurting people in the process. So, for our controls, for the food safety plan, we have our 4 types of preventive controls. So sanitation, allergen, supply chain, and process controls. Now under the HACCP plan, we just have critical control points. That is the same thing as a process control in the food safety plan. They changed the critical limits to parameters and values. That's to be more inclusive, because you'll have something like a label check being a preventive control. And critical limits kind of speaks to numbers when we think about it. And so they decided to broaden that base. Monitoring is the same. Corrective actions are the same. They added corrections, and that is because specifically around sanitation controls. So you have a sanitation control in your facility, and say, for example, you come in the morning, somebody didn't clean and sanitize well enough on the food contact surfaces, but you haven't made any food yet. Well, technically, you're doing this correction, but you don't have any unsafe food. And so that's why it's a correction, not a corrective action. So corrective action, you have a deviation, you might potentially have unsafe food. Requires a whole lot of paperwork, a whole lot of things like root cause analysis, corrective action, preventive action. So instead of having to do all that, you do a correction, and it's considered to be like an in-the-moment fix where you don't have any unsafe food. Verification is the same. Your records are the same. And remember, I told you earlier that you're required to have a recall plan for the food safety plan. So just a quick look at what's required and not required in your food safety plan. You're not required to have an overview of your food safety team or your product description. You're not required to have a flow diagram or a process description. However, you almost always see that in a food safety plan because it's really useful for whoever's actually reading it or building it, and for your auditors, right? To give them a good introduction to what's going on and what to expect in your system. You are absolutely required to have a hazard analysis, all the types of preventive controls, and a recall plan, and then procedures for the everyday actions around that. So those are your monitoring, corrective action, and verification procedures. So these are our different types of preventive controls. So process, those were CCPs, allergen, supply chain, and sanitation. And then, of course, we have our recall plan. Now, if I look at step-by-step, the 7 principles of HACCP you looked at earlier with CHIPS, these are the 7 principles of preventive controls for human foods. So it's the same thing where you first conduct a hazard analysis. So for the example I was talking about earlier with peanuts and the spices, that's our example hazard, right? So peanuts and spices. My preventive control is a supply chain control. So if I send somebody over to China to go audit this facility, I'm more likely to actually spot any kind of funny business that they're doing. Or if I require them to have that SQF certification, I know they're auditing themselves as well as having somebody else audit them, and that their standards are higher. Again, I have documentation that shows I'm less likely to have this problem. And supply chain controls are a lot about documentation. Then we establish parameters and values. And for our supply chain control, I have to use approved suppliers. So I've already vetted them. I've already sent somebody out to check on them. I've already reviewed all their paperwork and their systems and processes. Then I establish monitoring procedures. So how do I actually go about looking at this point to see if we're maintaining control. And again, for supply chain, it's a lot about paperwork, testing, so certificate of analysis, on-site audits, third-party audits, and a letter of guarantee. So you'll notice some of these are going to be paperwork that you receive when you get that product in. Then we establish corrective actions. So looking at our spice company, if the spice packets are received without that COA, then they segregate the product until they get the COA, or they return the product to the vendor. Verification follows after that. Verification is about, ensuring that your plan isn't working the way you wrote it. So I'm checking to see that, in fact, I am maintaining control when I don't have adulteration in my spices. So sampling and testing, right? You could do your own testing or send that product to another lab to do testing to confirm the results of the COA that they sent you. Again, looking over those third-party audit results. So you already had somebody do the audit, but you're reviewing that paperwork. That's a part of verification. And then reviewing the records surrounding this particular process. Finally, our seventh principle is record keeping. And so all the documents surrounding that particular process, those are the records that we're keeping. So the audit documents, the COA again, testing results, and any training documents as well. So if we look at the requirements for records for USDA versus FDA juice and seafood, you'll notice that for the USDA, you're required to have records around all of these things except for the adequacy of the process. And then if you look at FDA for juice versus seafood, you'll notice they're not exactly the same either. So just like we've mentioned as we've been going through the course, different products have different levels of risk. So that means that the requirements are going to be different for those products. So some companies are required to follow a limited version of this preventive controls for human foods regulation. And that'll depend not only on the product that they're making, but also the size. So we bring up breweries a lot because we all worked in breweries. Breweries only have to follow 3 sections, 3 subparts of the preventive controls for human regulations that the, an average company, like say, who's making pizzas, right? They would have to follow the full thing. Jeff says, in a USDA facility, they'll validate the adequacy of the process rather than just relying on the manufacturer to validate it. Yeah, that's huge. That means they're doing a much closer check on that process. They also have really specific requirements for certain pieces of that manufacturing process. And so, yeah, they're there to make sure that that's actually happening. So it can get a little bit confusing between what's USDA, what's FDA. It can be confusing between what's my product, what's somebody else's product. So if you're ever curious about it, it's a great idea to look up specifically in the FDA regulation and the USDA regulation, like what, or FSIS, what do we actually have to do? What's our side of the street? Any questions around that? I know it's kind of a lot of information.
Thank you.
All right, so true or false? Training is not required and doesn't have to be documented as a part of the preventive controls for human food. Adam says false. So does Matthew. And Michael. So it looks like most of us are in agreement here. So training is required, which we saw both from the FSIS side and from the FDA side. So we have to have training. We have to understand how to do our job. We have to understand food safety. We have to be experienced enough to understand what we're supposed to do. And it's 1:57, so I guess we're going to skip this video, sadly. If you would like to see this video, it's really great. It's in your Google Classroom. It's about a guy who eats pork tacos from an illegal food truck, and he ends up getting worms first in his gut and then in his brain. He lives, by the way. But yeah, it's a really, really good one. So if you want to see it, the link to the Google Classroom's there. And a quick note before we get into good documentation practices, I'm going to I'll resend you the Google Classroom link. And I'll also send you those forms again. Remember, you have to fill out both. So one, I just need you to put your name and your signature. And the other one, you'll need to fill out your birthday, your name, your information, but not your social security number. All right. If you haven't gotten those to me, please do by the end of today, because I have to send those off to the community college. And if we don't get them, then technically the community college doesn't believe you're in the course, which is kind of important for your documentation for this training. All right. Speaking of documentation, document control can be exceedingly challenging for a lot of companies, especially if they've established their system and they don't have a doc control system in place yet, right? There are lots of different things to think about. We've talked a lot about the different elements that are required in the HACCP plan and the food safety plan. And we know that if we didn't write it down, then it didn't happen. So what do we actually have to do, right? And we create documents around each of those controls that we made. We have documents that show our standard operating procedures and our sanitation standard operating procedures. Those go to a part of how we're telling the government regulators that we're doing what they want us to do, what we said we're going to do, right? So that's the how. And the records that are generated from that, that's the proof that we're doing it. And so in addition to these SOPs and SSOPs, you'll have records that show that you're actually doing that, right? So Michelle cleaned the bioreactor or whatever. Michelle cleaned the floor on November 15th at 2 p.m., right? It's also a good idea to have templates for all your documents so that everything's standardized. Everybody's making things in the same way, that they're easy to read. And then you track when those documents are created, when they're changed. And that way, if I have a recall that goes back 3 years, I know what documents I was using 3 years ago. 3 years might seem like a long time to you, but there are companies that have frozen food products where it's a long range product, right? Long shelf life. And they might have to go back that far. It has happened. There was one company, they made all kinds of frozen foods, and it was millions of pounds of frozen foods that they were recalling. You think about trying to track that paperwork back. It's a big job. Also having a master document list. So you know exactly what you're looking for, where it's organized, how it's organized. So that way you can access it easily. You also want your auditor you want to be able to get your documents to your auditors easily, right? So if they ask for your records, you got 24 hours, right, to bring it to them. So really, organization is key. The other thing, document issuance. So when I release a document, the change in my facility, so say I update an SOP, the change in my facility has to happen at the same time that I issue that document. And this is one of the biggest pain points that a lot of companies have, where they struggle to have that happen concurrently. And Jeff went over record retention earlier for how long you're supposed to keep each records and how. So when it comes to the standards for GDPs, for good documentation practices, it's probably stuff you already do, right? You're using probably blue or black ink, stuff that's not going to smudge or erase. One of the goals of good documentation practices is to prevent fraud and show that you're trying to be transparent and straightforward. and honest. That's why, say you finish writing a document, there's some unused white space. You draw a line through the unused white space so it can't be filled in later when it's not supposed to be. The entries need to be made by the person doing the action. So if I'm reading the measurement, I'm the one filling out that paperwork. If I make a mistake, which is bound to happen, I draw a single line through it, sign, and date it. So I just want to be as consistent and clear as possible. So for example, if I'm writing a date in a certain format, all the dates have to follow that same format. Units of measure. Think about significant figures. Go back to science class, which I'm sure would be fun for a lot of you. Making sure that those are all correct and standardized so that we understand what's going on and we're not missing anything. Let's see. Another good thing to think about is taking your time. So I want to slow down, check my calculations, make sure that I wrote everything the way it's supposed to. I'm not predating or post-dating something or just scribbling down the same number over and over. Those would be red flags to an auditor. Also, we have to avoid using things like sticky notes, scratch paper. Whatever document you write on, that's your original documentation. So if I write my documentation on my arm is my original documentation. There's actually an auditor who told me a story about this company that he was reviewing their paperwork, and he's looking at this particular set of forms, and he's like, I don't understand what's wrong, but there's something that's just not right. And so he goes back into the area that the document would have been created in. And he's looking around this work area and he's like, man, there's grease, there's a lot of moisture, like there's no way that a clean document could have come out of this work area. So he goes to talk to the woman who made the document. And she says, well, I write down everything on a paper towel. And then I take the paper towel to the break room with my company's documentation and I just copy it. So that way I always have clean records. So the only way that that's actually okay is if you would staple the paper towel to the company documentation, because that paper towel is the original record. And considering how long these records may have to last, right? 2 years, how likely is it that that paper towel is really going to stay in good condition for 2 years, right? Some other common mistakes that people make when they're doing their documentation. You might have 5 different SOPs, and some of them, the processes overlap. And maybe you make a change in one, but you don't make a change in the other 4, right? Then you might potentially create a problem for yourself. So just make sure that in your documentation, you actually have notes about, all right, this is references this other documentation. So that way, you can make those changes. You will make those changes as you go through. The other mistake we make is leaving out information. So when we're an expert in something, there's a good chance that we might just make assumptions about the knowledge base of somebody else. So for example, if I'm describing making sake to you, I might make a lot of assumptions about the things the words just because I know it really well. And so it's easy to accidentally leave things out. So we want to be very clear about who our audience is, who we're writing for, and what information we keep in and leave out according to that. Another key issue that people have is when they put out new documents, they don't tell people on the floor. They don't inform the employees of the changes that are being made. And another issue is sometimes there's just no formal supply of documents. So you change a document, nobody knows which document is the one that you're using now, the most recent one. I'm going to plug in my computer 1 second. There we go. All right. So another issue would be if I'm not doing my documentation at the same time as I'm doing the action, right? So that's what we mean by concurrently or contemporaneous. It has to be done at the same time. Maybe reporting something inaccurately because you didn't read it right, or you just didn't write it down wrong, you made a mistake, not remembering to fill out an entire document using ditto marks, can't do that. Signature has to be your actual signature, no signature stamps. This brings us to our documentation that is on the computer. You got to think about using a signature that is just as valid as your own personal signature. And we have lots of security and controls around those things when it comes to our documentation system. All right. Other common errors that we make, making a change and forgetting to date the change, forgetting to actually protect your documents in a virtual format, right? Or not organizing it the way you're supposed to, in a way that, somebody who's doing an audit or you yourself, maybe you're doing like a mock recall, can actually access and track and work through. Any correction you make obscuring your original data, again, it's just that single line through so you can see what went wrong. Using jargon. So if I use a word, MASH, might mean what it means, the same thing to me as you, but it also might not, right? So for me, I think of MASH, I think of green and water mixed together. You might think of something that you're smashing, like mashed potatoes, right? And when you make a mistake, you need to make sure you do complete justification of why it's happening, what's happening. So you cannot get rid of the original data or recordings. So think about that. You always have to keep the original copy. You cannot deliberately destroy records. That's a big no-no, right? That's when you're starting to get into that zone of fraud, which deliberately falsifying data is definitely fraud. When you correct an error, you basically draw a single line through. You write the correct information. You write why the error was made and what happened, an explanation. And you can footnote it if you need to, and that needs to be signed or initialed and dated. And any questions about our good documentation practices? So our last exercise, I know we're a little bit over, but this is our quick review. So if you guys are down for it, you can put the answers in chat or you can unmute, but we're going to do a crossword puzzle. So I want you to, let's start with one across. What is one of the 4 P's of GMPs? And you have this word bank on the side here to help you out. So the first one we say is product. All right. Product that did not turn out well. Let me fix that. All right, so product. And, or it could be procedure. See, PROCEDU does not fit. Let's go for 2 down. What's the acronym for current good manufacturing practices? CGMP is excellent. Let's see if I can make this a little less messy. 3 is Fat Tom. All right, very nice. Crushing it. All right. How about number 4? This is a physical hazard. Metal shavings. Very nice. All right, how about number 5? Liquid dripping onto the production line is example of this blank contamination. Cross. Yeah, very nice, Fred. How about 6? Sanitation Standard Operating Procedure acronym. SSOPs. Excellent. All right. Let's move on to so number 9, people. Great. And then let's take a look at, we've got 7 down, an example of a non-food contact surface. Drain, yeah. All right, how about 8? What does a virus need to multiply? Yeah, host. Nice work, Steven. 10 across. Hairnets must cover hair and what? Ears, yes. Moving on to 11. An example of a food contact surface. Knife, yeah. All right, then 12 down. Acronym for Food Safety Modernization Act. FSMA, yes. And 13. The Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law by whom? Trump. Jeez. We've only got 1 left in our word bank. President Obama, yeah. All right. Nice work, everyone. I'm so proud of you. That was great. You crushed that, and it was really fast. I want to thank you all for taking the time to do this and to be here. I apologize for keeping you this extra 17 minutes. A couple quick things. Again, do not forget to fill out those documents. I'm going to send you a reminder right after class to fill those out with both of those forms attached. Everything here is available in that Google Classroom. If you have any problems getting into Google Classroom and you want to, then send me an email